Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu. Today I'm joined by Dennis Murphy, who's currently a PhD student, Georgia Tech. Dennis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
So we'll go right in. You had written something about the Ukraine conflict, about the Ukraine war that's been happening since this past February. And if I recall your thesis correctly, there's not going to be any simple solutions or resolutions to that conflict. So maybe lay out what you wrote.
Sure thing, I'd be very happy to. So I first started writing about the Ukraine conflict before it happened. So in December and January, I was working on some research with regards towards the possible likelihood of a Russian intervention. And there were two distinct articles that ended up getting published in print for the Daily Beast about why Russia might invade. The first one had to do with the overall strategic leverage that Russia possessed prior to the intervention inside of the conflict. This had to do with the relative cost of invading Ukraine rising due to NATO and a lot of US arms support to the country. The second one had to do with the relative high prices of energy in Europe, because even before the invasion, there was an energy crisis inside of the European Union. And then the last factor to consider was this notion of internal divisions within NATO. As surprising as it is now, considering that the invasion has granted new life to the NATO coalition, if you start taking a look into things at the end of last year, there were a lot of people who were concerned about the future of NATO and were highlighting internal divisions, not just across the Atlantic, but within the European community itself. So people were worried and concerned. So I wrote one article saying that if Putin wanted to invade Ukraine, he has a pretty good window of opportunity right now to try.
That
And in
was
the
in
future,
January, or it was last year?
yeah, January,
January.
January of,
Okay.
I guess this year still.
Yeah, this year. Okay.
So there was this notion that his window of opportunity would close. So divisions in the transatlantic community come and go all the time. Maybe they would heal. The notion of the European energy crisis, the EU back then was already embracing this idea of the green energy revolution. And there was this notion that over time, their dependence on Russian petrochemicals would diminish. And the more arms and support was given to Ukraine, the more capable it would be to defend itself in the future. So if you were Putin at this time, you would think if I wanted to resolve this question of Ukrainian sovereignty and its position in NATO, you would want to do it then, because the longer you waited, the more difficult things would become. And of course, there were new announcements that started taking place, like the idea that the Chinese Russian partnership was one without limits. So there were other things going on behind the scenes. The second was that there was an escalation game that Putin was engaged in. So, starting from his escalation, which never really stopped from the spring of 2021, but really started gaining media focus in November of 2021. There was this notion that Putin was putting a lot of his credibility on this notion that he was going to try to resolve the Ukraine question through his own use of military force. There were a lot of military exercises around the frontier, and people were concerned that he was going to intervene. If you take a look at his internal dynamic, if he wanted to achieve his political aims in Ukraine at a time when Ukraine clearly didn't want to engage with them, and these had to do with violating Ukraine's own parameters of sovereignty, like giving up any idea of joining NATO or the European Union, partially subordinating its foreign policy to Russia. Russia has this weird idea about sovereignty. It actually thinks that a country that is aligned with NATO and the United States ends up losing its sovereignty and becomes a puppet of a Western force that it views as an existential threat to itself. They had Putin didn't want Ukraine to engage in an independent foreign policy, and it certainly didn't want Ukraine to have the ability to choose the West. Elections are fine so long as they result in the people he wants being elected. Treaties are fine and an independent foreign policy is okay so long as they do exactly what he wants. Ukraine wasn't involved in it. I didn't like that at all. So Zelensky and the administration worked together to try to calm the waters. There was a very clear intelligence sharing operation that was going on. Every activity that Russia made was highlighted, and there was a lot of concern that Russia was going to invade. And there were real forces in Europe that were downplaying that possibility for a while. So, in this type of framework, there were those that were essentially saying that if Russia was going to invade, it would have invaded already. This is all just an elaborate, coercive threat display to try to intimidate Ukraine. But if you take seriously Russia's aims and objectives, it could only really try to either negotiate down from them, thereby acknowledging a certain amount of defeat, i.e., acknowledging that Ukraine could choose to join NATO, or it could try to escalate further. But escalation prior to war eventually leads to war, which means that even if Putin didn't necessarily intend to start a war, if he thought that he could get away with it, he was ultimately putting himself in a position whereby he was going to damage himself by failing to escalate. And this logic, which existed prior to the start of the conflict, has continued throughout. Whenever a Russian force is defeated, whenever there's a withdrawal, wherever there's a new phase in this conflict and it looks like Putin is going to lose, he has two options. One is he can try to de-escalate and make the conflict smaller, or he can escalate. And if he chooses to de-escalate, there's this idea that he might be locking himself into compromising his own regime stability. So if he ever admits defeat, if he ever tries to end this conflict in a way that results in a loss for the Russian military, he could lose a lot of credibility at home. And there are those that believe, or fairly strongly suspect, that Putin would not be willing to do that. That if he were to engage in that type of situation, he would ultimately lose not just the war in Ukraine, but power in Russia and potentially his own life. So there are people that think that Putin has put himself in a situation where he can't lose. So if the only options are to de-escalate or escalate, and de-escalate looks a lot like defeat, then he only really has the chance to escalate when it looks like the war is going poorly for him. And this was a third article that I wrote. This one came out very early on in the conflict, around March. There was a lot of speculation at that time that the Russian front was starting to collapse, that this push for Kyiv was not going to work, that this intent to decapitate the Ukrainian regime and replace it with his own puppets, because he did have an alternative government back inside of that, wasn't going to work. So there was a shift in phase from a conflict focused primarily on trying to capture Ukraine, or at the very least its capital, and as much territory as possible, to one that was more attritive, attrition-based conflict, which would have been along the east and the south. So in that transition, there were people who were thinking that Ukraine was winning, Russia was losing, and that in Russia's defeat, you could potentially see an escalation to nuclear weapons use, that you could see a potential collapse of Russia's forces, this idea of a fear contagion, all of the things that were brought up just a couple of months ago have immediate precursors earlier in this conflict, in spring. So the idea behind that article was to just game plan out what some escalation pathways could be. And one was something that will sound very familiar to your audience, was this notion that Russia could try to engage in some type of black flag operation connected either to chemical weapons or captured nuclear fissile material, radioactive material. Because radioactive material has signatures that you can trace to the geography of where it was, I forget if it was the precise way of doing it, but that you can trace where radioactive material comes from. If you use radioactive material from captured nuclear reactors, the material that you use would look Ukrainian. or it would look as Ukrainian as anything else. So if you wanted to build a dirty bomb, and you wanted to say that Ukraine was building a dirty bomb with Western support, then even though it's a lie, even though this is very underhanded, you could potentially take that material, build your own version of it, and then say, hey, look, we have a captured version of a Ukrainian dirty bomb. Or you could try to use this for some type of leverage. Now, the idea isn't that they would use it. They could. And I definitely don't want to discount that. They definitely could. But in a way that is not as imaginative as you can be, because you could use this as a way to extract strategic leverage in some way or another by trying to explore alternative pathways. As of right now, it's just a threat. We have no idea if they have it. We have no idea if they would even pursue this, but it's a possibility, and it's a possibility that has remained live throughout most of this war. A lot of fear has also been linked to this idea of tactical nuclear weapons use. This notion that Russia might try to use a nuclear weapon that's not very high yield, which means that there's not a lot of fear of radiation contaminating everything. It would just contaminate a very localized area as a demonstration that Russia is serious about its intentions, that it would be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend itself. Because here's something that's going to sound very bizarre to people who maybe haven't been following this conflict that closely. Russia believes that the territory in Ukraine it has captured is part of its own territory. There were the referenda that recently went by in 4 provinces. These were rigged referenda. There's no sign that these were true, but Putin has made the claim that these are now parts of Russian territory. And if you take a look at Russia's nuclear doctrine, it's allowed it says that it can use nuclear weapons in defense of its own territory, even if the conflict is not nuclear in nature. As in, it can use nuclear weapons as a first use policy to defend its own territory. Now, this sparks a lot of debate in the US among expert communities. There's debate everywhere about this. A large number of people find that not credible in the least. And what I mean by that is that they don't believe that Russia will use nuclear weapons. They don't believe the threat is credible. They don't believe that they'll do it. And they're very concerned that they would even try because they believe that this would be such an escalation that it would just invite the complete collapse of Russia's foreign policy positions, and India and China would just forsake them, and that the use of nuclear weapons would potentially end up ruining the very country that they're trying to take over. There are a lot of people that think that this is a self-defeating move and that it just won't happen. And then there are people that do think that it might happen. And this is not an argument based on evidence so much. There is evidence to support this. So you can take a look at the work of Michael Kaufman. He's done excellent work into Russia's nuclear escalation ladder. But there are different positions on how you approach that evidence. And because we live in a world where no one has ever actually used a nuclear weapon, and Russia has never actually lost a land war on its own border in a way that threatened its own territorial integrity, claimed or otherwise, you have this debate that doesn't have a clear resolution. So you have those who are more risk averse, those who take the threat of nuclear weapons more seriously, calling for negotiations, saying that we shouldn't push Russia too far, that there are needs for off ramps, that there's some way to try to negotiate down from this so that you don't trigger a red line, that you don't cross some bridge too far that results in nuclear action. And then there are those that think that because the threat is incredible and that Russia would never use them, then you can push Russia back, perhaps well into the Donbass, perhaps even getting back Crimea. And these two camps are opposed to one another because we don't know which one is right. So when we talk about the nuclear threat, it depends on just how credible you think it is and which camp you believe in.
Well, I would ask the first camp, the off-ramp camp, what their definition of off-ramp entails. Because ultimately, if Putin really wants to win it, and the Ukrainians are, they would basically fight with a bare fist if they have to. I mean, the only leverage that the West has to end the war, you know, ASAP, is to stop the weapons supplies and the financial supplies to Ukraine, uh, and then and then basically allow Putin to capture Kiev for real. And I was just wondering whether that is a legitimate form of, off ramp, or whether that actually allows for more military aggression down the line.
So I will say that almost no one I've come across in the off-ramp community are willing to give up Kyiv. Like they don't they have clear limits on what they'll accept. For the most part, their big fear is motivated by the desire that the nuclear threshold isn't about what Russia can gain, but just how much they're willing to defend what they already have. So this off-ramp type approach or this risk-averse approach for negotiations is how do you stop how do you find the place where the battle lines should be frozen so that you can have an opportunity for a negotiated peace that wouldn't risk nuclear escalation? And one of the things to bear in mind right now is that the conflict did have a brief window where nuclear talk was highly hinted at and threatened with the fall of the Kharkiv area. But now there's an overall stabilization, and the stabilization is along a river. It includes the Donbass, it includes a large part of Zaporizhia, it includes a large part of Kherson. So there's a new attritive battle. And when things are slow, when the conflict battle lines are grinding back and forth, the threat of nuclear war isn't that big. When we fear nuclear war, it's when Russia is losing badly, and losing quickly. But there are plenty of people who have been talking about offering off ramps. Like rather famously, even before the war began, we were talking about off ramps for Putin. And rather infamously, Henry Kissinger called for an off ramp and a negotiated settlement. Um, his words weren't as bad as they are presented in some circumstances, but that was a somewhat infamous case. Most recently, Elon Musk found himself also calling for an off ramp, also calling for peace, also saying that we shouldn't risk a nuclear escalation. And he also got in some pretty hot water for that type of statement. You don't,
I would again question the off-ramp community, especially when you use the word peace, because as you might know, I mean, since the seizure of Crimea and the Donbass, we have about 5% of Ukrainian territory under Russian occupation. And that was effectively a frozen conflict well, I mean, there was, of course, a lot of killings, I mean, in that 8-year time frame. But it was effectively frozen. And we had, peace, the quotation marks. Um, and it clearly didn't bring peace. And now at this point, we have 20% of Ukrainian territory under the Russian occupation. And if we say, okay, well, then we give up these 4 provinces and hand them over to the Russian Federation. I mean, is there anybody who truly believes that this will be the final peace?
no. But there are some people who hold out hope that if this peace comes at a price that cost Russia so much that it would have difficulty even conceiving another operation of this kind, and that Ukraine becomes strong enough that it can punish such intrusions,
With
that you could,
20% of the territory and resources gone at this point, right?
yeah. I mean, Ukraine is sort of winning the conflict right now, even with 20% of its resources gone, even though its population is about a third or less than a third of the Russian Federation. They are putting up a pretty strong fight right now. So the issue wouldn't be how whether or not they'd be able to defend themselves in the future. Right now, the primary motive behind the off ramp isn't about legitimizing Russian aggression. That's the fear. So all the people who are more risk tolerant and don't want an off ramp, at least an off ramp in the sense of a negotiated settlement without Russia surrendering a lot of territory. Because there are some people that think a perfectly justifiable off ramp is Russia keeps Crimea, there's negotiations around the Donbass, it gives up everything else. So though there are some people that would say that that is considered an off ramp, and that gains some validity if the Russian position starts falling apart, and there's a very real chance that Ukraine could take it back. If anything, then it becomes a concession. So there is that side going on. But
Right.
there
So
are a lot of people who are fearful that this Russian invasion, if it's not sufficiently punished, will just result in further invasions. That if there is a peace in the spring, for instance, that keeps borders roughly the way they are, or maybe Russia gives some concessions, that there's nothing stopping Russia from 2, 3, 4 years down the line starting a new push, a new invasion, a new operation. There is that fear. And that fear was also very eloquently put by an ambassador at the very start of the conflict, who saw this as a potential heralding of a return to norms of governance in the international sphere where you could conquer by force to change the territorial boundary of land. There's a lot of people who are very concerned about that possibility. And a lot of them will have different ways of answering your question, too. So, right now, this idea is that Russia has suffered very substantial casualties. It has arguably lost any hope of maintaining the leverage that it once did over Europe as a result of engagement, driven primarily by Germany and other parts of the European community with Russia, and that Russia's own military is much weaker than it thought it was, that Ukraine is a lot stronger than it thought it was. So the opportunity for them to engage in that similar type of activity, given how much they've suffered thus far and how much their economy may contract next year, there are people who are reasonably hopeful that if there is a negotiated settlement, that Russia wouldn't be stupid enough to try this again. But of course, no one knows for sure. And I believe I mentioned already that I'm not entirely sure that this would be a permanent peace. This might just be a frozen conflict, or as some people like to call it, a simmering conflict, where there are steady casualties that prevent any type of negotiated permanent peace. And of course, a peace that results in a quarter of Ukraine's territory being occupied on a near permanent basis for Ukraine would be a peace that's no peace at all. It would be an almost unpardonable betrayal. So
right. So to
there's
me,
backs and forth.
like a real peace agreement that would be credible, and by credible I mean there will be no repetition of a Russian aggression, uh, would be to admit Ukraine into NATO. Now it's going to be a big question whether, I mean, so it will not happen now or in the immediate future, even though the Ukrainian government has filed an application to that effect. Um, but to me, this seems to be the the only credible resolution. Or I mean, if something that would be short of that guarantee would be the current policy of the West, continuing to train the Ukrainian armed forces and providing them with all of the equipment. I mean, from artillery to rockets to tanks and air force, etc. Um, uh, and basically having armed, you know, Ukraine, and that would uh, effectively be, a buffer zone between, I guess, Europe and Russia. And I mean, it's of course an incredibly sad situation to be in. I mean, if you're Ukrainian, but I also understand the Western, the NATO position that the reason why NATO hasn't gone into this conflict is because of the nuclear weapons that Russia has, and therefore I support the caution that the Americans and the Europeans are have with regard to this conflict. But to have this sort of like sitting on the sideline policy, from speaking from NATO's perspective, um, it also carries its costs, right? The fact that, like one of the reasons that the Ukrainians, I mean, after the successful Kharkiv offensive, has sort of been stuck at the front line for over a month now, because you saw that the Russians were doing mobilization, so they were throwing more soldiers to the front. Um, then the Ukrainian commanders are complaining about you know lack of equipment, right? Because I mean, there's some NATO equipment that is being promised and that's being sent in, but in wars, I mean, you consume so much material, right, in a very short order of time. So they just lack the resources in manpower and equipment uh, to accelerate their own offensive. Uh, so yeah, it's an incredibly difficult situation. But maybe it would be good if we step back for a little, because I think you went over that history of Ukraine Russia quite quickly, and let's go back to the like examining Putin's original motives to launch this invasion. So of course we can read his official statements where he says, we're against the NATO expansion, we're fighting Ukrainian Nazis, and we, that was his narrative. But I was wondering, I mean, what's the domestic policy situation in Russia? Because you have authoritarianism, which has always been there to some extent, but it's certainly gotten worse under Putin in the last couple of years. And I guess I'm citing this Bill Browder. He was this, I guess, British and American businessman operating in Russia, and in his argument, the war was about domestic policy. That is to say, yeah, there's a lot of corruption in the Russian state and the Russian bureaucracy, a lot of pilfering during good and bad times. Now, the problem, of course, is that because of the first round of sanctions, 2014, after Crimea invasion, um, the Russian economy has been doing quite poorly last couple of years. And so you have bad economic times, that you have the severe corruption, and that results in decline in popular approval for Putin. Um, and you know, the war ultimately is, it's kind of like whack the dog, right? Where okay, I provoked this war, and then and then people will like me again. So maybe talk a little bit about more about domestic policy situation in Russia as you see it in the run up to the war.
So, oh boy, that one's tough. So it depends on what time we want to set the clock back to. So a large part of Putin's foreign policy isn't just he wants to get rid of the Nazis or that he's against NATO expansion. He does believe, or at the very least, he says quite a lot, that NATO made certain promises that it wasn't going to expand NATO further east. And there are some people that you can read. There's some ambiguity at times. Like there's a book from a science professor called Not 1 Inch, which is a history of the end of the Soviet Union, early onset NATO expansion. But that chip on his shoulder, it's not entirely accurate. And I don't think that you're going to find a lot of people who have studied this period to agree with Putin at all. But it is this cornerstone of what he says is his foreign policy against NATO expansion. But it's not just NATO expansion. This is actually a much bigger problem. Russia takes a look at a lot of the post Cold War engagement, a lot of the increased economic interdependence, a lot of the support for liberal reforms, and in particular, support of human rights and democracy with suspicion and fear. There's a guy that everyone loves to make fun of in the IR community for a certain paper that he wrote called The End of History. This was a guy by the name of Francis Fukuyama. His idea was that democracy was going to triumph, that free markets and the democratic process was eventually going to spread everywhere in the world, and that we would see a shift in the way that geopolitics is conducted away from these big ideological conflicts like that of fascism, communism against liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, in a sense, won. And there are a lot of nuances to his argument. There's far more Hegel than you would ever expect from a political scientist. But this approach was endorsed by the Clinton administration. It was believed by a lot of people. In fact, the early idea behind engagement with Russia and even engagement with China was motivated by this idea that if you have economic integration, you have liberal market reforms, you could end up bringing these countries into the fold. And that economic changes would bring about political changes. And of course, we would support those political changes. It was not this idea that we would necessarily force them to do anything, but by sheer pressure of the weight of history, of the weight of the economy, of the weight of reform, that these countries would gradually change. And for a time, that seemed right. One thing that was not adequately taken into consideration is that these regimes were also well aware of those trends. And they started to instead interpret this not as the natural product of processes of obtaining increased wealth and supporting human rights and gradual changes. They saw this instead as a perfidious influence by foreign regimes to bring about the end of their political structures, their political regimes, and even a lot of their cultural preferences. So, what this instead sparked was this notion that these countries could try to oppose that. And what that meant is that they would try to increase information controls in their own population. There's a guy named Dan Treisman, a very famous Russian comparativist, who wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was presaged by control of media at home. And there's a very good reason for that. Russia believes in this concept of color revolutions. This is the idea that the United States and NATO use democracy, use economic freedoms, use the language of human rights to subvert the political authorities of authoritarian regimes. In a way, that makes sense. We don't like it when governments go around killing their own people or putting people in jail without just cause. We don't like it when they steal elections. A lot of legitimacy for elections in emerging democracies is partially contingent on electoral oversight. So one of the things that Russia did almost right away in Putin's regime was that he started to call into question third-party electoral oversight. Any foreign organization or even organizations with foreign money that were in charge of trying to make sure that elections were free and fair were seen as instruments of foreign power and foreign influence. In fact, they've now started to brand a lot of their own organizations, a lot of their NGO organizations, as puppets to the West. There's this idea that all of these organizations are, in fact, instruments to bring down the Russian state and Putin's regime in particular. And we see a similar fear of this in China. And we see this growing resistance to this gradual liberal economic democratic transformation in these countries being inculcated and facilitated in a large portion of the global south. And this is often associated with culture wars. Like there is this passionate, vehement distaste for what it believes to be Western norms around, say, the rights of LGBT people in Russia. In fact, as Russia's losing this conflict to, it remains to be seen if they've lost, but they are losing. As they're losing this conflict, you'd think that they'd have bigger priorities, but they're still going after what it seems as homosexual communities inside of its own country, still believing and to a certain extent blaming them for their own weakness in a regime. And this is because there's a linkage of cultural norms of progress, human rights, with Western influence. There's this idea that competitive democratic elections are actually an instrument of foreign actors. It's another reason why Navalny is in prison right now. So there's this notion that the West is trying to change and convert and to a certain degree suppress these other countries through the notion of electoral reform and economic reform and this emerging norms of human rights. So they shut that down in Russia slowly over the course of a couple of decades. China has been moving in the opposite direction now for a while as well. And there's this emerging consensus among authoritarian leaders that it's better to have tight controls over information, to be suspicious of foreign media, and to believe that outside actors monitoring elections are not to be trusted, that they are instead instruments of state subversion. But if you're going to do that within your own countries, you're also going to be worried about the countries around you. And one of the things that Russia has been terrified of is the color revolution phenomenon. And this is this notion that authoritarian governments that are weak and fragile have a color revolution whereby there's lots of protests, there's support for democracy, there's support for human rights, and then there's a local rebellion. And this rebellion, this protest movement brings down dictators. This was common for this was quite common in the post 90s, like early 2000s, well up into the mid 2010s. And Russia believed that all of these color revolutions, rather than being the natural voice of a people unhappy with its own government trying to suppress and control them, instead viewed this through the distorted lens of every falling dictator is a win for NATO, is a win for the US, and it's a loss for us. So what Russia has been trying to do is that it's been trying to prop up authoritarian states and states that are weak and that have faced color revolutions in the past. The Arab Spring is seen as the mother of all color revolutions, according to Russia. And if you take a look at a lot of Russian arms sales, a lot of Russian political structures, a lot of their interventions, it's always centered around this idea that it wants to tamp down on what it sees as dangerous forces, some directly tied to the US and NATO, others inadvertently unleashed by their irresponsible foreign policy. That is their position. That's why they have a very tight control of Belarus. The year prior to their invasion of Ukraine, Belarus had a lot of local discontent, a lot of protests. It viewed that as a color revolution, and they basically intervened, partially invading the place. Because in Belarus is not really an independent country in the way that we would understand it. In Georgia, their initial intervention now over a decade ago was linked to this idea of color revolution and the promise that it might one day join NATO and the European Union. This was not this idea of, oh, this is a country choosing its own future. It was instead, this was a former ally, a former deputy, a former country that wasn't really truly sovereign because it was in Russia's orbit, instead being weaponized, instrumentalized against the Russian state. And they fear these voices of division, these notions of ethnic nationalism with its own country. It will bomb Chechnya over and over and over again until it stops asking for independence. It did before. It might do it again, depending on whether or not there's a Chechen resistance movement that comes back. Now, this brings us to Ukraine. Ukraine was a country with very close ties to Russia. All of the corruption, all of the oligarchical nature, all of the same problems, Ukraine had them just as much as Russia did. And Ukraine was a country that occasionally liked to hedge between Europe and Russia, but it usually sided with Russia. Something started to change a little over a decade ago, and that was Ukraine started to more openly embrace language of human rights, economic integration with Europe, and opposition to corruption, and in particular, opposition to certain leaders with ties to Russia. There's a whole book about this called Russia and Ukraine by Paul Danieri. I encourage anyone who is interested in reading about this to go through it. It's just a narrative of a whole bunch of things that looks like it's going right for Ukraine until you realize that the end result is an invasion. Because the more Ukraine asserted its own independence, asserted this desire to lean towards Europe, once it got rid of a very corrupt leader and tried to have its own democracy back, and that leader actually fled to Russia, by the way. Their government that they were going to use to replace Zelensky was linked to the one that was replaced. So this idea of color revolution was actually something that led directly to their intervention. They went into Crimea the moment the government that they were supporting fell apart. They went into the Donbass very shortly thereafter. And then there was this notion that they could still try to manipulate and pressure Ukraine to not join NATO. In fact, Ukraine's leaders said that they weren't going to, even right up until the invasion. So there was this there was this pressure point over there. But ironically, it was self-defeating. Russia took over territory in Ukraine that was more pro-Russian, which meant that in the electoral process, people who would have voted for Russia's preferred candidates were instead not voting at all. Russia ended up crippling its own potential faction in Ukraine so that it was inevitably going to lose out in the long run, that Ukraine was going to push further and further for European economic integration. And that was the general direction that it was heading in. Enter the road to war. This road to war was this notion that if Russia can't change Ukraine's politics through an electoral process, then it will try to change it through force. This was the regime change idea. This was not an attempt to just subjugate Ukraine. This was, in a way, an attempt to push back the clock on economic and political reforms inside of the country. This was a counter revolution in the clearest sense of the word. This was an act designed to undo what it believed to be pernicious influences tied to color revolutions in Ukraine. And Russia seems like it's going to try to do this again elsewhere, but we don't know for sure.
Okay,
But yeah,
let's
that's the road to war.
yeah, let's take this color revolution and Western interference claim that Putin makes. Now, now I would say it cannot be completely dismissed because there were U.S. officials who were strongly in favor of the Maidan uprisings back in 2014, and they wanted to have a certain person to become the prime minister after Yanukovych fled. I think Yatsenyuk was his name. Um, so the U.S. has a role in this in these color revolutions, but I would say it's not the decisive role, right? I mean, I would still say that, as you mentioned earlier, that there is a domestic uprising effectively against corrupt political leaders, and I must assume the way how Ukrainians could be mobilized in favor of anti-corruption reforms and more honest political institutions is by I guess some kind of like osmosis, like a relationship with the West, because you have like hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who, for instance, they work in Poland, right? And of course, within Poland, I mean, Poland itself is at the periphery of the European Union in the sense that there are rule of law violation claims made by Brussels against both the Polish and the Hungarian governments. But anyway, but there was still perhaps from the Ukrainian perspective the realization that you could have a government that is more democratic, more accountable, and less corrupt um, if you align yourself with the West, so with the European countries, and that if you stuck closely with the Russian camp, you wouldn't be able to get rid of these corrupt leaders. So I guess the point would be that yes, there's a point that Putin makes that cannot be completely dismissed. I think that the U.S. has an influence on Ukrainian politics, but I wouldn't say that it's the decisive role that caused the Maidan uprisings. Yeah,
So I would agree with this idea that the United States and the European Union typically likes leaders that are not corrupt, that support human rights. They typically stand next to and support protesters that otherwise would be imprisoned or shot. There are clear limits to what the United States and Europe are willing to do. We certainly ran into one of those limitations in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang. There are clear limits to what we are willing to do to support people who arguably are very deserving of our assistance and support. There are those clear limitations. And is, of course, population traffic. So Ukrainian people who spend a lot of time in Europe come back home, they see their society is corrupt, they want to change it. That's it's actually an old problem. It's a problem that's almost perennial for dictatorships. This notion that you send people overseas to gain technical knowledge or to gain money, but instead they're exposed to ideas that change their orientation to politics. Um, every now and again, there's that suspicion that if you send some people to a communist country, they'll come back supporting socialism. But the far more serious and credible idea is that if you send people to a democracy and they can live under a democratic regime, and then they come back home, there's a whiplash that occurs when they come back and they realize that they aren't living in a country where they can speak their minds or engage in the political process or indeed even escape poverty, because economic and politics, those influences are often intertwined with one another. So when Ukraine goes to Poland or Europe to a Ukrainian goes to Poland or Europe, elsewhere in Europe, they are not just living in a freer society, they're also making a whole lot more money. And then when they go back, their opportunities are relatively weak. Um, so that's undoubtedly a part of them. But I would say that a lot of this is just a natural progression of forces and incentives. Yes, the United States and Europe generically support democracy and often specifically get involved. In fact, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have international wings centered entirely around supporting democracy. Like there's the International Republican Institute, there's a Democratic equivalent, and it's just our political parties. They have some former staffers or they have some former congressmen that then go out and support democracy overseas. It's something that we do. And they're often linked, sometimes officially, most times not, with US's official foreign policy. This idea that we want to support the aspirations of local people to be democracies, to be free, to not necessarily have political forces oppress them in the future. And sometimes this results in us getting called hypocrites because there are clear times where we support more times than others. Oftentimes, we're most willing to intervene when it's not just a human rights problem, it's a human rights problem and something else. So we are occasionally accused of hypocrisy, and sometimes the accusation stings a little. But we do just have aspirations, and these generic aspirations are something that we have all the time. It is the very idea that we have that aspiration that is seen as a threat by Russia. And they take that aspiration as an official face whereby it presumes that any form of activity that is in alignment with that is a result of some form of clandestine statecraft, like Radio Free Europe, for instance. Is that trying to support human rights, or is it a vile instrument of Washington and NATO to try to undermine the strong, robust leadership of dictator Putin? There are people that will say one way or the other that, of course, it is. But Russia overplays this accusation, and it overplays it deliberately, in large part because I believe that Russia doesn't want to acknowledge, or at the very least can't acknowledge publicly, that it's going against native aspirations of people in these countries. Because if it acknowledges that these local populations want this democratic reform for themselves, that they want this liberal economic reforms for themselves, that they want human rights for themselves, and they're not being influenced by a pernicious outside force, then it damages their own ability to counteract these forces. Instead, their primary mission is about trying to compete influence wise and support these regimes in controlling their own information spaces. And most of that information space ends up resulting in this pseudo political hacking, occasionally called political machinism, whereby you associate all the things that are good about your country's historical cultures and traditions with the authoritarian side, and all of the things that it perceives as pernicious or degenerate or outside of the norms of society or associated with some minorities with this Western influence. And it gets way out of hand. So yeah, Russia can say that there's a fair point there, and there might even be a fair point there to a certain extent. But they don't treat it in a way that we would understand as a fair way of treating it. They have a totalitarian approach to this. They assume that they assume that we are doing what they would have done. In fact, one of the most brilliant misunderstandings to ever happen in the history of people spectating Russia's way of warfare is that they assume that Russia's idea of gray zone conflict or the Gerasimov doctrine are Russian inventions, that that's their approach to warfare. The more you look at it, the more you'll find out that that isn't really what the Russians want to innovate in warfare. It's what they think that we're doing. They take a look at all of these events going on in the gray zone, all of these events with regards to information control, all of this Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare, and they say that's what the US has been doing. So they then try to do it themselves. And there's this refracted mirror, this vicious cycle of perception and misperception that's driving a lot of this. And it's honestly in question whether or not we can believe that Russia has bought into their own misperceptions or if they're just using this for propaganda purposes. We simply don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of both, because clearly, I mean, this whole idea of like, okay, i- I'm going to invade Ukraine, uh, simply because I can, because I want to dominate Ukraine and I want to, them to be part of my empire, I think sounds a lot less legitimate than saying I'm hunting Nazis, right?
Yep.
So there's a legitimacy issue with being superbly blunt with your intentions. But I wanted to go back to this point about U.S. influence in the world, and I guess some critics might call it U.S. imperialism, but we don't want to be too overly focused on terms here. Um, I do see that that there's a shift away from I guess U.S. Hegemonic claims making. Um, I mean, if you think back to Bush Senior, when the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the first conflict that he waded into was the Second Gulf War, right, which was about punishing Iraq for invading Kuwait. And then under Clinton, you had you know the bombing campaigns in Yugoslavia, right, former Yugoslavian countries now. And then the second Bush, that was probably the height of I would call it U.S. aggression, really, which was a full-scale invasion of Iraq, and then toppling the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. But then some people would say, well, we've seen probably since the Obama administration this idea of retrenchment, right? That the U.S. wouldn't go in and blindly make full-scale wars anymore. I mean, of course, you still had drone warfare, in Middle East, Pakistan, and so forth. But you wouldn't have full-scale aggressive wars anymore. And then you had the America First doctrine under Trump, which sort of gave it another reinforcement, more isolationist in orientation. And then when Biden came in, his first foreign policy decision was to complete the Afghanistan withdrawal, which was agreed upon by the Trump administration last year before he left. Um, and now, now the U.S. neocons now take this Afghanistan withdrawal as, I guess, the green light to Putin to go into um, Ukraine, which just happened, I guess, really half a year later. Do you see in any way that the U.S. decision in completing the Afghanistan withdrawal and the Ukraine invasion by Russia having any connection, at least in the mind of Putin?
So it's very difficult to completely discount the notion because Putin did make numerous claims about an irresponsible America creating a mess and then not cleaning it up with the withdrawal. And there was a lot of note about the division in the Euro-Atlantic Alliance and NATO, sometimes brought up about from Afghanistan. So, for instance, a lot of our partners were deeply unhappy with the way that we left and the way that we communicated our intentions to leave. So the NATO force inside of Afghanistan was NATO. It was not just the United States. There were an extensive amount of contractors and European military forces inside the region. And when we left, there was a great deal of chaos, there was a great deal of concern, and there was actually a large number of NATO people, or at the very least, people connected to NATO countries, that were struggling to leave, and some were even left behind. This was a very important point of contention. Another point of contention was linked to the AUKUS arrangement. So that's the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. When that was announced, or very closely connected with that, was Australia ceased a purchasing agreement for a French nuclear sub, and that they would get it from another buyer linked to this alliance, which really upset the French because Emmanuel Macron was not really consulted or told. Maybe he was told. I mean, there's always the diplomatic discussions that go on behind closed doors. But in the situation that they were in following this, Macron announced publicly that he was very unhappy about this. So there was a lot of situation that caused some tensions between the United States and our allies in Europe. And to a certain extent, the relocation of refugees, how to deal with the humanitarian problems that took place inside of Afghanistan afterwards were ongoing concerns. And there were plenty of people who were deeply unhappy about this. So there is some cause to link them together, especially if you're inclined to believe that there was some um, intimation of weakness that Russia was sensing in NATO because of these divisions. There are some people that give some credibility to that, even outside of the neocon community, like the centrist Democrats often will make some reference to that. But I would be hesitant to endorse the idea that Putin saw this as a green light. I think that Putin might have saw this as one factor among many that led to this green light decision. And I know we already talked a little bit about this road to war stuff already, but one other thing to bear in mind is that Zelensky was one of the most unpopular leaders that Ukraine had ever had prior to the invasion. He had a negative approval rating of like 30 or 40%. There was no notion on Putin's part that Zelensky would stay in Ukraine or that it would even fight for it in the long run. So there was definitely this problem that occurred there. And I mean, it's difficult to disentangle. There were too many things going on at the same time to link it to Afghanistan. But there are some people that do. And I'll just say that I know someone who used to be a senior official in the US government on defense issues, who, as soon as we withdrew from Afghanistan, said that Russia would try to pull something in Ukraine. She was someone who you could consider a neoconservative, but she was predicting that to happen. So um, I
Yeah, I
guess
mean,
she might have been partially right.
yeah, it's very hard to sort of wipe that argument away because I mean, there's no way how you could undo history, and also, you know, you know, even there, I mean, I would have even like if I had known that Putin would have invaded Ukraine, I would as a U.S. president or as an advisor to the U.S. president, I would still have recommended the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Because I mean, if you remember in Biden's speech, I mean, he said, this is a war that's been going on under, five American presidents. I don't want to pass the buck anymore to any future leaders. Um, I mean, if you consider the war that partially accounted for bankrupting the Soviet Union, right? It took about 10 years or so, right? When I guess the well-armed Mujahideen, with the help of, the Pentagon and CIA, um, was, yeah, draining the Soviet Union, and then, there was a collapse ultimately of the Soviet Empire. Um, and that was for 10 years. And the US, of course, being much richer, I mean, of course, could afford to stay on for longer if it wanted to. But I would still, because the whole Afghanistan operation was building on the faulty premises of being able to not only topple the Taliban regime, but also social reforms and equality for women and democratic reforms and all of these things. Surely there was some social progress that was happening in the NATO occupation, but but it was also not stable, right? Because as soon as the Americans were announcing the drawdown of troops, the official Afghan army that was supported by NATO wasn't willing to fight against the Taliban that was retaking territories in the provinces. So right, so you couldn't really defeat the Taliban, and and once that premise was accepted, which I think the Trump administration and also Biden acknowledged that finally. Um, yeah, then the only right conclusion would have been the withdrawal. And so I think it would have had to be done anyway at some point. I'm sure you're familiar with the sunk cost theory in economics, right? I mean, you don't want to, like if you know that the Afghan government that was supported by the West would have had to fall at some point, you know, why not acknowledge it now? I mean, ASAP, essentially, right? So instead of wasting 30 years of treasury and blood, it's only 20 years, right? Um, so I would still think that, the Afghanistan withdrawal was the right decision, and there was no way how to, you know, have done it nicely in a nice way. Um,
That's certainly the consensus view. So let's say that better part of half, maybe two-thirds of people who work on Afghanistan thought that it was a conflict that was going to lose, and that at a certain point it would make more sense to simply engage in that cost calculation and to withdraw. I will say that there are just two responses to that before you finished your main point. One is that there are some people that disagreed with the premise of that notion. And then there are those people that agree with that notion, but still thought that the withdrawal was handled particularly poorly, and that the reason why the Afghan army and government collapsed as fast as it did was directly connected to actions that we took. So, for instance, the Afghan army was made dependent upon US contractor support and US military support. And part of our withdrawal plan was terminating that. There was even this notion that any type of technical support or assistance that the Afghan army could need could be found over Zoom. That was mildly infuriating to quite a lot of people. So there are deep fissures in that community. So a large number of people agree that it was probably necessary to leave. Some disagree, but most people agree that it was necessary to leave. But when it comes to how it was done, entirely different ballgame. Most people are deeply unhappy with the way that it was done. For starters, we should have at least told Europe our timetable or tried to work around that so that there were no conflicts between us and them as we were trying to withdraw our people, and that there weren't plenty of their people left behind or seemed like they were going to be left behind until a lot of fast moving work that took place at the very end. And even the fall of the Afghan government in Kabul was something that people saw coming. As in, the very first thing that I wrote for the Daily Beast was an article saying that we needed to provide certain guarantees to the administration in Kabul, or else it was going to fall apart and we would have a situation where people were fighting each other to be on the last helicopter to leave. That was in the inbox of one of the editors at the Daily Beast the day before it fell. And then afterwards, I needed to rewrite. So the first article I published on the Daily Beast is a desperate plea to try to stay in Kabul longer than our projected withdrawal date because it was not enough time to get all of our people out. It was certainly not enough time to get rid of all of our local partners. And if you follow any people who worked with what used to be No Man Left Behind, now I think it's just No One Left Behind, there are people still working on getting refugees and local partners out of Afghanistan. So the withdrawal we handled particularly poorly. So if we're going to connect that to Russia and Ukraine, it was done badly enough that you could make some linkages if you wanted to.
yeah, I mean, so obviously, so the Russia Ukraine is certainly one of the issues that's still on the a- agenda. Okay, I still had one question about that Ukraine conflict, which is where do you see this uh, going next? Because we started the conversation the with your talk about the nuclear weapons and the nuclear escalation. I mean, it seems to me that that this will be the last tool that Putin really has, because I think that even with the mobilized soldiers, I don't think he has the equipment at this point to, I don't know, complete the envelopment of the rest of the Donbass. Also considering that he already lost Liman, the northern part of the Donetsk province, um, and the Ukrainian troops are outside of Swartova, a big city in the northern Lugansk. And then in the Kherson's situation is looking quite bleak, because the Dnieper River is such a huge barrier to reinforce the Russian garrison on the west bank of the river. Um, so I guess part of the calculation that Russia is now making is number one, so attack the infrastructure, so destroy the electric supplies of Ukraine, so that it makes it harder for them to supply the frontline troops, but then also um, create misery among the Ukrainian population, so maybe they become wary of the war and settle for peace. It's about hoping that the winter is going to be cold in Europe, so that the gas bills go up, and if unemployment goes up, inflation is already high. That could be another pressure point against uh, to sue for peace. Um, yeah, so I don't know. Where do you see the next part of the conflict?
You've put me in a fine tradition of almost since February February 25th. People have been asking how the war will end, and uh, I wrote an article, I think in June, maybe July, where I essentially say that no one really knows how this war is going to end because warfare is contingent. There are a bunch of different ways that things could go back and forth. We talk about nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are the big thing. They're the exciting, terrifying, world ending thing that people focus on because it seems to be one of the big things that could potentially bring about the end of everything. But nuclear weapons are very likely not going to be used in the foreseeable. Certainly not for the immediate future, not this month, maybe not until, maybe not, maybe the prospect of this happening won't be until the spring, because the spring is where a lot of focus is going to be put on. Because in the spring, you're going to see the end of winter. You're going to see a gradual change in the dynamics of the conflict. And if Russia hasn't been able to get its act together in the wintertime, and that there are no fissures in the European alliance, and that there's no midterm surprise for the Russians in their expectation for support for Ukraine, then you could see them getting more desperate again. For right now, it's unlikely that things are going to end too badly for them too quickly. And there are a couple of reasons for this. We have a large amount of insight into how Russia's fighting forces are doing, but we have relatively limited insight into Ukraine's own losses and equipment shortages. They didn't push as much as they could after Kharkiv fell, potentially because there are reasons for that. They might not have had the available manpower for it. They might not have had the logistics trains available for it. They might not have had the munitions to make a serious offensive. There are a lot of things to consider around that general area. We don't necessarily know how Ukraine has been doing, how many soldiers they've lost, how their volunteer pressures are moving on. Because it's one thing to defend your hometown when the Russians are literally walking through it. It's another when you're in New Jersey and you want to liberate California. You have a relative fewer number of people who are willing to go there, and their knowledge of the terrain is a little bit less. So there's some dynamics around there. We also don't know the full effectiveness of Russia's fighting force, in particular, its munitions and its equipment. We have been talking about Russia running out of bullets, running out of artillery, running out of the ability to fight war since April. They're still doing it. We don't we don't know what their limitations are. We have this expectation that they will eventually run out because of course they will eventually run out, but we don't know what their stockpiles are. We do know that they got a little bit desperate a couple of months ago. They were raiding Belarusian supplies. They were buying old Soviet equipment from the former stands. They were trying to procure Cold War military equipment from North Korea, and they were purchasing equipment from Iran, most notably their drones. The drone pivot is rather famous now. But Russia was trying to get around its shortages. And if you're particularly suspicious, you could think of some of these countries as potential middlemen for, say, China to be inadvertently, not inadvertently, but indirectly supporting the Russian war effort. And there's a reason to suspect that that might be true, because the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a think tank in Washington, D.C., is going to be releasing a report soon, or has released a report soon. A guy by the name of Dmitry Alperovich spoke about this like a week or two ago, talking about growth of Chinese semiconductor exports to Russia. It's apparently up by about 200% or something around those lines, which means that Russia's ability to fight this war is definitely not as optimal as they would like, but there's reason to believe that there are alternative pathways for them to continue up their fighting. There are observers who go there and say that Russian artillery is still fighting, Russian air power is largely still unaffected, and that Russia is still willing to fight and defend the territory that it has. There are people who go there, they see that, and they're concerned. Then there's the question of mobilization. So mobilization was treated in the Western media as this drastic policy move that might have been a very big mistake for Putin because automatically people were running from the country. 200,000 of them were fleeing to Kazakhstan or the Caucasus. There were people focusing on that.
The potential total reserve force is like 2 million men, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Russia has like almost 150 million people. I think they have like 140 million people. Losing a couple 100,000, bad, yeah. But you also need to remember that Putin is an authoritarian regime. Putin is in charge of an authoritarian regime that doesn't like dissent. So you could think of this almost as a safety valve. All of those people running away, they're probably well educated. They may or may not have voted for Navalny. They clearly don't want to fight for their country in a war in Ukraine. They're clearly worried about being drafted. If you're Putin, this is basically like the Cuban refugees. Be gone. We are more stable without you, because it ends up becoming a political safety valve. All those people that might have been resistance factors inside of a force if drafted, or protesting against the regime if they stayed, are now gone. So that's one thing to consider. A second thing to consider is that these civilian people being pulled out, they're not going to be thrown directly into the front line like some kind of meat grinder. This is going to be a phased, slow mobilization. In fact,
well, some of them have been thrown in, right? I mean, I think like 80,000 have already been
some of them, yeah.
activated in the front.
Some of them, yeah. But there are also people that are just former veterans that are being recruited and brought over there. And then if you're recruited and put into the military, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to the front line. You might instead be in charge of logistic support or holding territory. So you don't necessarily see a lot of these fresh-faced people with no training being thrown to Ukrainian guns and artillery. You don't necessarily see that too much. And there are people who are growing concerned that if Russia is smart about how it uses these reservists and how it uses these new people who are being mobilized, then you could essentially see a refocus of Russia's effective military fighting force away from logistics and holding territory to fighting, so that they might be able to be more capable of doing that. And of course, these reservists, yeah, now they don't really know what they're doing. But as weeks turn into months and months turn into longer periods of time, then these aren't fresh-faced people that don't know what they're doing. They're they might not have the best training, but they at least have some on-the-job training, some idea of what they're doing, and then they can be more integrated into supporting roles or auxiliary roles in the actual violence, the actual war fighting of this conflict. We don't know how this winter is going to turn out. We do know that Ukraine is already cycling through power shortages because it can't keep the lights on all the time anymore. We don't know how their heating situation is going to work out because Ukraine gets cold in the winter. Meanwhile, Russia's ability to maintain power and heat its own place is still relatively strong. And you have these people coming in, and maybe they'll be used effectively. At the very least, this is a manpower multiplier, as in they're going to get more out of having these more people. And at the very worst for us, they might be far more capable than we initially suspected. Because let's face it, when we take a look at this Ukraine conflict, our media is captured by this notion of Russia collapse, Russia defection, Putin regime stability on the verge of ending. People are trying to overthrow Putin among the oligarchs. They're very unhappy with him. There's a lot of things out there suggesting that Russia is an incapable fighting force that's destined to lose and lose badly. But while they are losing, we can't say with certainty that everything that we're seeing and hearing in local media, like in the big newspaper publications, are entirely reflective of the environment on the ground. And if you listen to some of the analysts who look at this conflict closely, they say that they focus a lot on Russia, but they don't want to focus too much on Ukraine because highlighting weaknesses and stress points in the Ukraine army is not a good thing if you know that the Russians have the ability to read you and learn what these problems are. So we don't necessarily know the full effectiveness of Ukraine's fighting force. We just know that they have high morale and that they're willing to fight until the very end. At least Zelensky says that they're going to fight to the very end. And there's been some polling data that recently came out. I was at a Ponar's conference last month, and there's some people on the ground polling Ukrainians that wholeheartedly believe that they're going to win and that they're going to win big. And they're probably going to either push Russia back all the way to the Donbass and Crimea, potentially even taking back the Donbass. Some think that they'll take back Crimea too, but not a lot. That's actually not very high in the polling. So you have this situation whereby maybe mobilization will enable Russia to claw back an attritive portion to this war. And instead of looking at an end by spring, which is what some people hope, as in I hope it will end by spring. This might end up turning into a multi-year conflict, whereby things are going to solidify and that they're going to stagnate. Now, granted, we did think that that was true earlier in the summer, and then there was the Kharkiv situation. That oblast fell apart and Russia withdrew. So there's a very real chance that Russia might have a similar situation emerge. And there are also people eyeing Belarus very suspiciously because Belarus has thus far stayed out of the conflict. But if Putin pressures them enough, maybe they'll open up a new front. And in that case, then a lot of Ukrainian forces on the border need to be shifted to Belarus. That might cause an issue. And there are a lot of people concerned about attacks on infrastructure. So, as everyone was focusing on the nuclear weapons object, because nuclear weapons are terrifying, they deserve to be talked about, but they don't seem likely to happen now. But as everyone was focusing on that, they missed a couple of things. One was Russia said that it might blow up Starlink constellations, like Starlink satellites, Musk's satellites, which have been instrumental for Ukraine to fight this war. They get a lot of their
To
internet.
basically target GPS target the artillery. Um,
Yeah, there's some of that, but it's also just communications. Like they're able to talk to each other effectively through satellite communications, and they're also able to access the internet through satellite communications. Because when Viasat went down and a lot of the infrastructure was targeted, one of the one of the main open lines of communication you still had were the Russians. So all the Ukrainians could have a front row seat to see what Russia was talking about their own government, but they didn't have immediate access to like other forms of information. Starlink was a potential game changer. In fact, if you take a look at a lot of the stuff that came out in April, affluous praise, like nonstop praise for Starlink, until Putin put his foot in his mouth. But people were very happy about Starlink. Russia, one of the leaders there, a guy named Konstantin, whatever his last name is, threatened to make Starlink satellites legitimate targets. This was also around the time that there was the accusation of the dirty bomb. But in a way, you could also take a step back and say that Russia is deliberately playing up these potential actions, potentially regardless of their intent to use it, because then that means any other action they take is comparatively less escalatory. Now, this is more speculative, but I've shared it with a couple of people, some in government, some not, which is this idea that Russia might be playing up these types of threats so that we would be less likely to respond to more limited strikes against infrastructure or some other way to disrupt Ukraine. And of course, Russia has also flirted with the idea of tampering with domestic um, infrastructure inside of Europe. So, for instance, there was various incidents that went around European energy. Uh, Energy, I forget if it was targeting Norway, but there was some pipeline that they targeted. There was also a train that
Nord
they
Stream.
targeted. Yeah, yeah, there was a lot of things. Nord Stream, slightly different, but yeah, they probably blew up their own pipeline, which is one hell of a way to make a threat. And of course, they also have their vessels every now and again flirting with undersea cables. So, like the internet, you think it's like everywhere. It's really not. There's an assortment of under 1,000 underwater cables, which is responsible for 95, 94, 93% of all internet traffic that goes across countries. Like European internet isn't through satellites, it's through underwater cables. And there was a threat that Russia would cut those types of cables. So, what would that mean? We don't really know the threat, but that was again an escalation limit. We talk about nuclear weapons as Russia's last resort, and it is. They have a whole host of other things that they can do to seriously mess not with Ukraine, but with us. So the idea that Russia is going to lose and lose badly right now is a little bit at odds with the stability that we see and the restraint that we see outside of Ukraine. When Russia starts to lose and lose badly, they're going to start screwing with us. And they're going to screw with us in very creative ways.
Is it also the case that the West has more to lose simply because the size of its economy is bigger, right? So, I mean, if you have a, if I mean, I looked up like NATO is like $45 trillion in GDP. So it's a huge economy, and I know in Germany, I mean, I follow the debates very closely. I grew up in Austria, so I follow German language debates. And they are very concerned about deindustrialization that happens from their gas dependence and the fact that you cannot access as much gas as you would require to both heat the homes as well as power the industries, especially the chemical industry, which requires gas for a lot of the reactions that they need. And if the chemical industry shuts down, then other industries that are connected to that, like semiconductors, machinery, cars, engines, etc. All those industries will also be negatively impacted. Um, and then it could be scary because if the worst case scenario was going to be, a rationing of gas within industries, then that would be followed by an increase in unemployment and layoffs in those sectors, and then of course in connected industries, like for instance, like the local bakery shop has to shut down because the workers are no longer coming to shop there and so forth, right? that the the overall mood could shift very rapidly, because now it's like, well, okay, it's easy to, put the blue, yellow, Ukrainian flag up your house, if it doesn't cost you anything, right? But now, if you're facing destitution potentially, um, you're like, well, okay, the Ukrainians are too far away, basically. Why should I care about them? And I think that's I think the biggest card. I don't think it has anything to do with on the military side, because I do think that the mobilized troops, I think they'll probably stabilize the front lines for a few months. But as far as like a giant offensive, in the sense of like, a second run at Kiev, for instance, I mean, I don't see that happening at all. So I think that, really the economic leverage, uh, the ones that Putin has left against the West, that might have an impact. Though I saw recently that the gas prices have decreased recently. The winter's warmer than we had anticipated, or this, I guess, fall season. So maybe the Europeans might have enough gas left in their tank. And Yeah, so I'm not sure how to read all of that. I mean, I do think eventually it's going to be tough for Putin, um, because I mean, if you remember, the green energy minister, right? He traveled to Qatar to sign the gas supplies. So it was back in April, and he was really kowtowing. I mean, you could see it in the photo how he was bowing down. And this guy's from the Green Party. I mean, he was supposed to be like anti-gas, anti-fossil fuel, like Greta Thunberg. But yeah, I mean, it seems like the Germans. I mean, within, I would say, 2 years, 2 to 3 years. I mean, not immediately, but within the foreseeable time frame, I think they will be able to cut their gas connections to Russia completely. Um, so I do think that over time, the economic leverage that Putin has over Europe is going to diminish drastically. Um, and that, yeah, that sounds like it is bad news for Putin. I mean, so in terms of the economic relations, um, I saw there was a substantial increase in exports of Russia with Turkey and with India. India purchased a lot more oil. For China, the numbers were actually stable. So that suggests that the trade before the war has already been huge. Um, and um, yeah, the Chinese position was, okay, we're not going to sanction Russia, so we're not going to cut our imports. Um, but but there was also nothing about specifically increasing imports either. So yeah, so I'm not sure of eventually. I mean, how decisive the Chinese are in supporting the Russian war effort. I'm sure, like the semiconductors that you mentioned, I think that's certainly a valid element. Um, and also, Xi Jinping saying recently that nuclear war must be avoided. I think that was a message to the Kremlin, and I think that that Putin would take that um, quite seriously, quite that statement by the Chinese leader. Um, so yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, if I had sort of the Russian national interest at heart, I would say, you know, this conflict has to be wrapped up very soon. Um, uh, but we don't know. I mean, I also have a feeling that, you know, there's something Hitlerian about Putin in the sense that that he would never recognize defeat. Um, that, you know, I don't know, we're gonna reinforce Kherson like, you know, Stalingrad, right? Uh, or like Waterloo. Um, and that's quite scary. I mean, it just means that for the world community, it means that that we're going to be living in a high tension, you know, world in the foreseeable future. Uh, yeah, is another aspect that you wanted to raise about Ukraine that we haven't talked about? I mean, or
So I can respond to a few things that you just mentioned. So, for instance, this notion of vulnerability to Russia. Yes, we are vulnerable, but it's a difference between short-term and long-term vulnerabilities. So Russia has the ability to inflict a lot of short-term pain on us, but not exactly long-term pain, because we have the ability to dynamically adapt. This is most certain with energy. So the European Union is maybe, I don't know, a decade away from not needing fossil fuels if they really put everything that they need to into it. That's still a long time. But the thing is that fuel, while there are pipelines for natural gas, but for things like oil, fuel is a global commodity, which means to a certain extent it goes on a global market, and then there's different infrastructure that you can use to then bring it elsewhere. You said that fuel prices got very low in Europe. It's true. They turned negative for a little while. And the reason why is because Europe has successfully been stockpiling fuel. A lot of the panic over increased fuel prices that took place earlier this year was in large part because European governments were buying additional fuel to bolster their strategic reserves so that now the reserves are very nearly full. So that demand is easing up. As a result, for now, at least for this winter, there should not be any significant problems keeping Europe warm. There might be a problem keeping Ukraine warm, but there should be no problem keeping the European Union warm. And this dovetail with the relatively warmer winter that they're likely to see, which means that there's even less demand for the reserves that they have. In the future, there's a question about just how much those reserve levels might be maintained. There's this idea that maybe in like 2 or 3 years they might not be able to do it. But Europe has been building new ways to have liquefied natural gas come in, uh, fuel transported over sea rather than through pipelines. There are also pipelines that you can access through Turkey and through North Africa. So there are approaches to solving the fuel problem that's ongoing inside of Europe. There's also the Norwegian field. Scotland has its own petrochemicals. And the Netherlands closed one of the largest European uh, petrochemical extractions. I think it was like the Groningen gas fields. There was a large amount of fuel there that they're just leaving because there's some chance that it might have a negative interaction with their geography, as in they were, the more they pumped out, the more they were actually sinking a little bit. But if desperation ends up happening, they could turn that on for a little while, maybe. In much the same way that coal factories were turned back on, because coal is still relatively abundant, still relatively easy to get. And then there's the nuclear factory dispute. What's the right way to do green energy? French very much saying nuclear is perfectly fine. We should just build more nuclear. Coalition politics being what they are inside of Germany, nuclear is not as favorably looked upon. In fact, they said that they were going to shut them down along with a coal factory early on in the war, which was rather foolish of them. But there are ways to get around this energy problem in Europe so that in the long run, there's a general favoring of the European Union and the US in particular from Russia's leverage over their energy markets. Russian energy elsewhere did go up. In fact, Russia has been making more money than we thought they would in this conflict, simply because of high energy prices. So that even if they're selling not to their preferred partner and it's more expensive to sell it to them, because energy prices are high already, they actually get more out of it. Um, there is some problem with China. In fact, some of the contracts that they got from China were actually not beneficial to Russia. But if you're not making any money, then maybe making some at a loss is still better for you. So there is that situation. But yeah, for India, it's been up. So Russia has been pivoting more towards a global South Eurasia approach to its economy, which is a potential danger, by the way, because as you see this decoupling between Russia and NATO, you see a recoupling and a reentanglement of the Russian economy with countries that we have far less influence over, countries that you might be more dubious of, in particular China, but also the stands, Iran. Rather notoriously, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, OPEC Plus said that they weren't going to increase their um, gas outages. In fact, they actually started cutting in some circumstances, which means that they actually are having a foreign policy that's sort of in alignment with Russia. So Russia can influence Europe. In fact, it has been influencing Europe. It turned off Nord Stream before it probably blew it up. So there's a lot of stuff going on over there. Russia also has a selected toolkit to bring a lot of pain to Europe, but it's a double-edged sword. We have a lot of tools in our toolkit to completely wreck Russia. So Russia can do some stuff to say, hey, we might cause some problems to you, back off. But they know not to push too far because if they do, I'm not sure Putin will stay in power if he literally can't turn on the lights and his infrastructure is broken in the middle of the wintertime. So, like, there are ways that we can really damage Russia that we aren't doing because it's a mutually exposed vulnerability. In fact, we don't expect Russia to blow up any satellites either. It's a threat, but if they start blowing up satellites, they could actually just render a large portion of space just inoperable, including for their own satellites, because some of their more elliptical orbits that they use for their satellites need to go through low Earth orbit, which means that there's a lot of debris there, and you're having these very irregular patterns for your orbits. You're probably going to end up increasing exponentially the vulnerability to your own satellites. So Russia's probably not going to do that, especially since it will also screw with Chinese satellites. They don't exactly want to make China too angry right now. China did say that it would increase its support to Russia, though. There was a conference, I think, about maybe a month or two ago in Central Asia. Uh, and during this conference, China basically once again reiterated its support for Russia, and it's going to be sending some, if it hasn't already, it will be sending some additional support to Russia. We don't necessarily know if it's military. We strongly suspect. In fact, that might be one of the reasons why we enacted part of the CHIP Act to make it more difficult for China to have its own semiconductors work and function. In fact, we might have pulled that lever in response to something that China was doing. It's it's ambiguous, it's unclear, because a lot of things about modern politics can be opaque, but things are happening. So there is this realignment. In that realignment towards a more Eurasia global South, Russia might come across better for itself in 10, 20 years as well, or it might just become satisfied with being less. So a lot of people are focusing on Russia's brain drain problem, about it not having economic vitality and innovation. To a certain extent, I don't think that Russia cares as much about that. It can outsource its economic vitality and innovation. For the most part, I think it just wants to maintain some solidity in its own position, and then it can make those types of reinvestments in economic innovation in, say, 20 years once they have a firmer footing. So there are
Yeah,
a
I would
lot
say in
of
terms of
things going
like
on.
strengthening the authoritarian regime, I mean, wouldn't it be better for the population to stay poor, right?
Yes,
Because if you are poor, I mean, then you're worrying about your own immediate survival. I mean, you're not gonna think too
Yeah,
much about getting involved in politics and challenging, Putin's corrupt regime, right?
yeah, and it also depends on how much you think that Putin buys into this Aline character, this Russian thinker from like the 1920s, 19 teens. So, I mean, in that model, which Putin sometimes cites, the idea is that you shouldn't have a middle class at all, anyways. You should just have a very large, dispersed population that has most of its decisions handled by an oligarchy and a big leader. Because, like, a bourgeoisie element is not to be trusted in society because they occasionally want power and they want political control and political influence, and that's apparently bad if you're an authoritarian regime. So, yeah, earlier I mentioned that a lot of people were leaving Russia. A, it's not that much of the population. B, Putin's probably happy about that because all the people who would be most likely to protest against him are leaving. And he has a pretty strong police state. So he's able to pick up protesters and put them in jail, and most of the time we won't be able to see. In fact, his control over local information means that we need to be even more suspicious and dubious about what we see going on inside that country because we don't have a lot of outside media inside of the region. We don't have a lot of neutral observers to what's going on inside of Russia. We don't have the ability to monitor a lot of these protests. We have no ability to see what's really going on in their prisons. Everything that we kind of see are leaks that then get blown up in media, or we have some third party observers, because of course there are still plenty of people who aren't from Europe and NATO that go to Russia, so we can rely on them to a certain extent. But there's a lot that we don't know. And as far as Russia is concerned, if you take seriously the idea that they have strong information monopoly, they have that type of power to control and influence the population, then yeah, I mean, Russia hasn't seen very much economic growth all that much outside of occasionally when oil is doing well for years now. They could reinvent themselves as the number one pirate of other people's innovation. And so long as the overall standard of condition living condition inside of Russia doesn't get too bad, they might be just fine.
Right. I
Very at
mean,
least they might
if you
claim
look
to be.
at the main commodities within the Russian economy, it's food and energy, right?
Yeah,
So I mean, actually, I mean, if you wanted to have a bare bones economy, which the West is trying to enforce with the sanctions policies, where basically um, Russia would have to rely on its own resources for survival. Well, it could, right? I mean, if you produce food, you produce energy. So those are the bare bones of any kind of economy, right? So it's this idea that you're gonna get Russia to starve itself to submission. I think that is not going to happen. I don't think. Yeah. So now okay with this authoritarianism. I mean, of course, the other example that you were raising was China. And so you recall the conclusion of that party congress that confirmed Xi Jinping as the undisputed leader. Um, eh,
yeah,
but but there was this interesting scene where Hu Jintao was dragged out of the his chair, sitting next to Xi Jinping. And yeah, so if you watch it closely, I mean, you could see, based on Hu's facial expression, that he was um, not prepared for this, and he didn't want to leave the room. And yeah, so my impression of that stunt, which was done on purpose because it was after the cameras were invited back into the proceedings, was for uh, I guess to show to the world and to show to the lower level party officials that Xi Jinping is the only ruler in town, and that the collective leadership that Deng Xiaoping set up 30, 40 years ago uh, was going to be ditched for good, right? Because I mean, what would be a better way to demonstrate, this, ditching this principle, than forcefully removing your predecessor. Um, yeah, and then and also, I mean, and then there's also a lot of domestic challenges in China. I mean, I think the biggest one has to do with the pursuit of zero COVID as a strategy. How viable is that? I mean, the economic numbers are deteriorating a lot, and a lot of economic growth figures are not reported anymore, actually. So I mean, I just attended a talk by a Chinese American economist here at Princeton recently, and he was still talking about like growth models and how CCP officials get promoted based on the GDP performance of their province, of the jurisdiction, and but even he admitted that maybe with the party congress, the performance metrics for CCP officials will no longer be economic performance, but rather, um, I don't know. I guess it's loyalty to the leadership ultimately, like this party discipline. That's what Xi Jinping emphasized when he first came to power. Um, yeah, so I guess my open-ended question to you is, how do you evaluate this you know situation in China today?
Sure. So it was definitely a power move with Hu Jintao, but we don't necessarily know what was going on. We don't know if there was a lot of behind the scenes problems. Other people were surprised. At least one other person up on that stage was initially potentially going to support Hu Jintao, but then was stopped. I think it was the guy next to him. So there are a couple of things going on over there. But taking a step back, it's impossible to believe China's numbers anymore. China's economic numbers, the more we look at them, the more worthy of suspicion they end up becoming. To a certain extent, a lot of China's growth has been a little bit exaggerated. So if you make economic performance a metric for whether or not you get promoted, then you end up seeing a lot of really crazy schemes. Like for one instance, there was economic activity in the agricultural sector that was being monitored for a province. So they took a parking lot, they put a bunch of soil over it, they plowed that soil to grow some stuff. A lot of them didn't even grow, but they ended up using that as a metric for GDP growth. So here we created new arable land, we employed workers to produce. And because overall agricultural growth was up, they just cited the increase in growth in the agricultural sector. And this is a process or a path that people use to get elections. This is a much less severe, much less notorious way of getting that type of promotion that you actually saw during the Great Leap Forward, because that was a rampant, uncontrolled exaggeration of numbers. China's numbers recently haven't been exaggerated to that extent, but they've been exaggerated maybe 5%, maybe 10%, maybe 25%. And there's an increasing number of reports trying to find new metrics to analyze China's GDP growth, one of which was taking a look at their average light pollution. And if you buy that metric, I mean, of course, you need to take it with a grain of salt. Even the author takes it with a grain of salt. If you do that, then China's economy is like a third less than it claims to be, maybe even more, depending on how you count. So there are problems of using economic growth as a metric inside of China, especially since a lot of that growth is not necessarily sustainable. This is the difference between sustained and sustainable growth. And then another portion of this has to do with how much of that growth was actually government funded through mutual debt arrangements. So there's this type of scheme or plan where you have two banks who agree to loan each other each a million RMB at the same interest rate, same loan, which means the payments are the same, which means you actually don't need to ever actually pay back a loan. And this just generates new money that you can then invest into your chosen pet project. And it's actually notorious in China. This happens quite a bit. They've been tamping down on that a little bit, but by tamping down on the illusion of perpetual high performance growth, you need to find a new metric. Because if you don't really trust the numbers and you actually think that you might be setting yourself up for failure. So, for instance, if China's economy is a lot smaller than we think it is, and that it's a lot less stable than we think it is, and zero COVID has been causing them a lot more problems, then a lot of their preemptive moves to becoming a great power vis-a-vis the United States are premature. And if they don't have a solid foundation, then they need to find a different way to assert their own political control and their own autonomy. We used to believe in the authoritarian social contract because we had a bunch of people doing research into it. We ended up creating an entire little cottage industry centered around this idea that dictators have a new form of social contract, which is you can have a prosperous economic life, just don't talk about politics. So long as economic growth is going, it's fine. To a certain extent, that's even endorsed by some authoritarian leaders. But we need to be careful because we actually sort of made that up. We studied a phenomenon, we applied a label to a phenomenon, but we don't really tend to have conscious awareness that that thing that we say they're doing might not actually be what they think they need to do. And they might find an entirely different type of social contract, one centered around loyalty to the party, to the institutions, one that might find more engagement with a more wolf warrior nationalistic approach more useful, one that as soon as the economic growth numbers start going down, you then say English is not as important. So in China, they're actually trying to walk back a lot of the teaching of English in some places. They're also trying to walk back teaching of non-Mandarin, non-Putonghua. So they're also trying to standardize a lot of the dialects. So you remove some foreign influence, and if Chinese people are not able to read English, then their ability to climb the wall and get over the Chinese firewall is sort of compromised. And if you find a more increasing standardization in the language, then you're able to recreate and solidify national identity, which is a portion of what China's trying to do. And if you can't focus on economic growth models, then yeah, loyalty to the party, loyalty to Xi Jinping, loyalty to the national dream of the Chinese Communist Party ends up becoming a different framework. And because a lot of their investments overseas are not serving purpose as much as they hope for, and a lot of their engagement with Asia and Europe has been less successful than they hoped, then you could actually see this re-entrenchment, very similar with Russia, towards a more Asia-focused, non-ocean focused approach, Asia and Africa. And you can see some movements in that direction. It's not solid, but you can see some movements alongside some investments in Latin America. So China is changing. It's changing the way that it engages in politics. There's a sense that a lot of people are unhappy, but when you live in a regime where expressing unhappiness is constantly monitored, and even the former leader of your country, someone who is supposed to be a retired statesman with a lot of influence, particularly among factions and their political lineage by all the people that they supported through the ranks, get manhandled and thrown out of the Congress, you end up creating a situation where no one's really safe. And if you take a look at some of the people who are also known suspect elements, like those rich bourgeoisie people, those leaders of companies and corporations, being on the list of wealthiest men in China is basically a prison sentence. Like most of those people end up going into jail at some point. Most of their assets are seized. And a lot of those people who end up becoming wealthy are usually white gloves. This is like a term. They represent particular people in the CCP as a legitimate business interest, as in Say you're friends with some standing committee member or some local party chief. They help you set up a company, and then you end up becoming rich, and then you're expected to give those riches back. And if at any point that person's political star starts to fade, well, then the white glove ends up also getting uh, the subject of a lot of intense scrutiny. And because China is an environment whereby it's not rule of law, it's rule by law, there's this notion that most of these government officials and most of these corporate elements have mutual vulnerability to one another because they've all engaged in some form of criminality to a certain extent. There's always this dossier that there's safety in knowing that everyone else is guilty too, but then that just means that it can end up being turned against you. So that the moment your star fades, you go to jail and you lose all your assets. So you sacrifice, I don't know, some element of your future to be insanely rich and powerful for some number of decades. And there are a few people who write about this. There are a couple of people who run away from China and then writing memoirs about it. Probably one of the more famous one that came out in recent years is Red Roulette by Desmond Shum.
This one, Shum, yeah,
Uh,
that's a book I'm reading right now. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So
uh,
he's covering part of that. And
yeah, I
his
mean,
wife,
yeah. So his wife, where he was a close associate of the wife of Wen Jiabao. So Wen Jiabao was the former prime minister under Hu Jintao, actually. And in Shum's account, Wen Jiabao is not corrupt. So he's just running the government. But his wife, who owns a jewelry business, but actually invests in a lot of projects that Shum and his wife, the associates of Mrs. Zhang. Mrs. Zhang is Wen Jiabao's wife. Um, yeah, they're running a bunch of like kind of a shady businesses, and I guess the main point about association with Wen Jiabao's wife uh, is to lend legitimacy, right? To I don't know, they want to build a port facility or some airport or something like that, right? Some infrastructure project. Um, and by saying that, well, we know the wife of the prime minister, so you're going to give us the contract, right? Or you're going to give us the loan to fund the project, things like that. Or you're going to give us the approval, yeah. Um, and the rule, if I remember correctly, was like 30/70. That is to say, I think 30% was the kickback that Wen's wife would get, and then the remainder would go to whoever partner that she has that initiates the project. Uh, yeah, and I think there was like there was this big New York Times expose, right? That's the reason why the New York Times was banned from China behind the firewall, I guess.
I'm wondering if I should spoil that book for you. Something very interesting happens with the wife, but I won't spoil it for you. I'll just say one key lesson from it until you finish that book. It's a short one. It should take you maybe like a day of intensive reading. So the wife often says, even if you beat me, no dirt will come out. I'll still be clean. Like I'm clean. I'm not dirty. I'm not corrupt. When you live in a corrupt society where everyone is to a certain extent dirty and soiled, where everyone needed to make those compromises and backroom dealings, taking incorruption as a sign of pride is dangerous for two reasons. One, it makes you an object of hate because that person that's clean over there, one, you don't really believe it, but two, if everyone else is bound together by this mutual notion that everyone else is sort of a criminal, having the one person that's not a criminal in the midst ends up becoming a threat. And two, you live in a society where truth doesn't matter because at any point, someone's star can fall. And in the process of their falling, dossiers can be made and crimes can be asserted regardless of whether or not they've actually been committed. Innocence is not protection from being convicted for a crime in China, nor in a lot of other places.
Given that
It's
there's no rule of law.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
main
because
assumption.
it's ruled by law. Yeah, in these authoritarian countries, it's ruled by law, totalitarian even, which means that law is an instrument to impose the will of the political leadership. So that simply by being against the leadership and being a target that the leadership wants to get rid of, you are de facto guilty of some law. And if they can't make one up, if they can't find some law or resurrect some 100-year-old statue that got uh, barely ever enforced, which does happen every now and again. I think it's like an idiom, like resurrecting a law to deal with someone. Then they'll just make something up. They'll accuse you of something else. They'll invent certain figures, and all you need is a confession from someone that you're probably paying off or threatening in order for that to happen. So it can get nasty really quick, really quick.
Yeah. So that's yeah. It is quite concerning. And but I was reading a news report. I think it's a French newspaper about the judicial system in Russia, um, which is also. I mean, it's not a real you know judicial system that we understand in terms of
Nope.
rule of law. I mean, it's basically. I mean, if you cross the regime in some way, um, famous cases like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Vladimir Kara-Murza, and there's a few of these. Navalny, of course, the guy that got poisoned. Yeah, so it's either poisoning or it's imprisonment, torture. I mean, these are all part of the repertoire of the regime, ultimately uh, to quash any kind of dissent. And that's what characterizes these authoritarian regimes. But but also, so of course, there's different ways how you can study authoritarian regimes. I mean, you can look at factors of resilience, like what means are they using so that they can stay in power for decades and decades. But I think it's also interesting and important to study the cracks that can um, uh, be created within those regimes. Um, and I think some of the stuff you already mentioned, right? The fear of the color revolutions, um, and the Tiananmen protests in '89, and I think that certainly I think uh,
The
if you
Iranian protests.
yeah, I mean the main fear of the rulers is that uh is that those color revolutions could become so serious that it couldn't be suppressed. So right, so with the Iranian situation, I mean, maybe could you tell us a little bit about yeah what's been going on in Iran, and why is it that the
I can
protests are
I can
happening now?
I can say a few words about it. I can't speak too much to it because I'm not an Iran expert. I am a great power competition type of guy. But this was a protest instigated by the death of a young woman who was wearing her hijab improperly. And this caused a protest movement that spiraled into a great conflagration with a lot of people deeply unhappy and deeply unsatisfied with the Iranian regime and its rules, particularly with regards towards women. Protests in Iran happen more frequently than you think. There's usually about two big ones a decade. This one is particularly big, which means that its relative absence from international coverage is kind of surprising because usually we play into this quite a lot. We see a protest movement, we typically support it, typically shows up in the media a lot. It's part of the 24-hour news cycle. And this keeps going until there's some type of government crackdown and inevitably um, it ends. This time around, it's been growing and there's been a lot of threats about crackdowns, but it hasn't thus far worked. But we also haven't really been covering it too much. And we don't really know why. But to disaggregate from the primary point that you were trying to say, these authoritarian regimes are inherently fragile. All of their emphasis on trying to obtain control over the institutions of the state, over the information that its people are exposed to, is inherently a reaction to their own perceived vulnerabilities, their own perceived shortcomings and weaknesses. Why is China turning away from economic growth as a metric for success? It's because it can't really keep up that promise anymore. Not only is there decoupling, it's also alienated a lot of its close neighbors through military movements, like in the South China Sea, and it's caused a lot of problems at home. Its own growth model was not sustainable. It was linked towards corrupt practices, and cracking down on the real estate sector before it threatened to break up China and become another source of major instability ultimately was also linked to slowing China's economy, like with Evergrande. There were a lot of things conspiring in China that was weak, which is why it needed to pivot. If it didn't pivot, those things could eventually snap. And even in China, even when Hu Jintao is being forcefully led away, and for a while we didn't know what was going to happen to him, apparently he's just been humbled. Like he hasn't been disappeared or is inside some CCP jail somewhere. He's just been humbled. This was a way to humiliate him, essentially. So even when that was happening, there was still a protest on a bridge. Like a guy lit up some fire over a major interface uh, and had a sign protesting the regime. I mean, it didn't last very long. He disappeared, but for just a few brief moments, not only was he seen by a lot of people, but a lot of people took photographs and videos of him. So that even in a state as tightly controlled as China, even in the very heart of China's power sector, even in a place where there are plainclothes policemen on virtually every corner, willing and ready and able to take care of any form of disturbance. One still happened, and news of it got out and spread everywhere. We don't know what that's going to mean in the long run. We don't know if this control over information is as strong as advertised. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe we live in a world where 1984 is just 20 years away, and we're going to have a lot of trouble trying to overcome that. But at the very least, we don't live in that world yet, which means that a lot of these countries are concerned. Their primary enemy isn't another country. China's enemy isn't the United States. Russia's enemy isn't NATO. It's their own people. Their own people are the largest threat to their regime stability. And Russia supporting all of these counter-color revolutionary forces all around the world is inherently a sign of its own weakness because those efforts are only as strong as the most brittle leader they're engaged in. So if a country's government is going to collapse, no amount of random Wagner supporters or CSTO intervention forces are going to keep it alive, especially if they're incompetent and corrupt and can't manage their own people well. And once one domino falls, a lot of other dominoes might fall soon after. The reason why the Arab Spring is considered a color revolution is because color revolutions partially preceded it, and the Arab Spring took one conflagration, one self-immolation in Tunisia, and it threatened to bring down the entire order of the Arab world. Now, granted, there were plenty of backlashes, like the Arab Spring was followed by an Arab Winter. There was very strong authoritarian backlash.
Like in Egypt, for
But
instance.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, but that sparked a protest when as far overseas as Asia is. And there was a color revolution in Hong Kong briefly. There was this color revolution that spread everywhere. To a certain extent, the reason why all those color revolutions failed might be because they weren't adequately supported. As we saw this authoritarian backlash, in a sense, they were left to kill as many people as they could to ensure that after bombing their own cities and killing their own people, that they could be kings among ashes and ruins. This is particularly true in Syria. Is that a victory? Is that a sign that this type of regime is stable? No. No, it's a sign that the mask is off. There's no authoritarian, godfatherly system. They're ultimately upheld by guns and violence. And guns and violence sometimes aren't always loyal to their masters. And certainly plenty of people inside of Iran have not taken up the opportunity to shoot their neighbors, their sisters, and their mothers. So, yeah, some
Right.
hope.
So I think, yes, social media seems to be this big underhanded story here, and I think it seems to be, a curse and a blessing at the same time because I mean, on the one hand, so you have instantaneous communication. Um so if I'm an Egyptian back 10 years ago with the Arab Spring, I would have probably seen that Tunisian man self-immolating on a video that was shared on social media. And that was probably what I would have then taken as initiative to um, unleash the protests. And then similarly, I mean, I think recently, right, in Iran, it's not just the woman that was killed with due to not wearing the hijab properly. There was also another woman who was going on a sports championship, I think. She was climbing without the hijab, and then she was being imprisoned when she went home. Right. So, but these are interesting stories that can basically spread very quickly, instantaneously, and I think that's the world that social media created that we haven't had at any time in history before. But then at the same time, it seems to be that, well, the limits to the social media is that you're not creating the organizational resources, from the civil society perspective, to sustain these organized, anti-regime protests. And so that is to say, it's not enough to post the message, let's meet at whatever 3 p.m. in the central square. But you also have to figure out ways how to, um, I guess, like the logistics of organizing protests, right? 'Cause I remember when this Occupy Wall Street happened in Philadelphia, downtown Philadelphia. And in the early days of the encampment, so this was before, of course, police eventually came in and tore down the camps. Um, but in the early days, I remember that food was served quite regularly. It was brought over by volunteers, and then people that bring their own griddle and the ingredients from the supermarket. And there was sort of like this communal setting, and singing songs, and people that brought their music instruments with them to keep the spirit up. And there's I remember that was towards the beginning of the encampments, and then as the weeks went on, I think you saw kind of less of that, and then eventually most of the people that were then hanging out in encampments were homeless people. They were certainly not the ones that you would expect to be the leaders of any kind of revolutionary uprising. Um, so yeah, so right. I guess the point being that yeah, it's the world of social media maybe makes it easier to get on the streets, but it certainly doesn't make it easier to keep on the streets and to keep the pressure up against the regime.
That's true. So social media is definitely a double-edged sword. Like I remember in our early conversations, I had plenty of very strong opinions about social media, and I still do. Um, I'm very skeptical of it. And there are people that write about it all the time. Francis Fukuyama, just to bring back him, he's still alive. He still writes. He still does a lot of stuff. He's still pretty influential. Shows up at SAIS every now and again. He's associated with Stanford. He had a foreign affairs article that came out, I think, last year or this year, where he said that big tech is a threat to democracy and that we need to try to deal with the monopolies of big tech, including social media. Another scholar wrote something called The Chaos Machine, which is talking about social media's propensity to introduce not only instant information, but also disinformation, various political polarization, and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about social media, even when it's free, even when people can do whatever they want with it. Another reason to be skeptical about social media is that there's an increased desire to have government owned or influenced alternatives in authoritarian regimes. Here are the obvious examples, basically every single one in China. So Weixin or WeChat, Weibo, their version of Twitter, these are very open to Chinese censorship. They pull up or pull down trending topics all the time. They can use that to influence and manipulate what people see. Part of the reason why it was so remarkable that information about this protester over the bridge happened is that a lot of that initial spread was through these government monitored accounts. They tried to shut it down afterwards, and they did eventually succeed in shutting down most of it, but it was enough for it to get a life of its own and then escape China. Through the process of escaping China, it became something. So, yes, there's a double edged sword when it's free, and then it can also be weaponized against a population. So if you don't have access to Twitter because Twitter is banned, and you don't have access to Facebook or anything else because they're banned, and you only have a government monitored alternative, one, you're going to be much more careful about what you say there, and another thing is you're not going to see a lot of what you need to see. So social media can also be double-edged sword in that way as well. But insofar as it is used, and insofar as people are able to climb the wall, a lot of China's restrictions on the internet have proliferated to a lot of these authoritarian regimes. Russia has its own version of it now. Iran has its own version of it now. A lot of the Middle East and North Africa are toying with it. And these types of information controls are certainly things that you would be dubious of and skeptical of. And you can also be very fearful of them as well. And there's a lot of reason to be afraid of what these countries are trying to do with social media. But for every measure, there's a countermeasure. So there are ways for local dissidents to try to gain access to this. And yeah, they might not go anywhere. They might spiral into malaise and nothingness. I would say that Occupy Wall Street's failures might have more to do with it being Occupy Wall Street in the United States than that being some type of general rule. But there are reasons for this type of cycle to happen. Another plus side, much less discussed, is that a lot of countries not behind these firewalls have reasons and incentives to try to break it. So, at a certain point, like one thing that might be hoped in the future is that if there was an attempt on Iran to try to crack down on a lot of these protests, maybe we would try to make sure that their tools to crack down on it don't work or have the opposite effect. Well, wouldn't that be funny? Or not really funny. That's too much irony. Wouldn't it be useful and helpful if, say, the Ayatollah wants to remove a trending topic for a protest movement, but instead, by doing so, he ends up amplifying it, which that could be a very useful way to use social media in the future. Because a lot of the reason why the Arab Spring died down as much as it did is because it was monitored. It ended up becoming a target list. A lot of people were put in prison, and it ended up being co opted by more radical elements. Not all the time, not everywhere, not universally, but there were several instances where the Arab Spring transitioned into a more jihadist based insurgency. And some of that was just linked to these are the only people capable of fighting against this regime that wants to shoot me. So why not join them? So there's also a whole discussion on whether or not some of these more off the rails offshoots of social media are entirely genuine representations of social media just going bad. Um, there are different ways to approach this. And I'm sort of rambling a little bit too. So I'll
Yeah,
stop.
so I found one example quite interesting. I listened to a podcast recently where they mentioned that in Russia, YouTube is still allowed, and in Iran, Instagram is allowed. And we know with the Iranian case that a lot of the anti-regime mobilization has come from using Instagram as the communication tool. Um, and and then they brought up in the podcast, okay, well, why is it that those regimes do not dare to shut down specifically those social media services? And apparently the answer is that so of course ideally, I mean, the regime wants to prohibit the use of any kind of social media and communication tool among the political activists, right? So that's the minority of people that would be inclined to join the protests. But then also they have to consider the opportunity cost of that, which is you have the vast majority of the people that are normally non-political, right? And they use those services as the primary forms of entertainment. So if you're shutting down the entire service, you're not just quashing the activists, but also the non-political population that uses the platform for entertainment. And you could say that, I mean, that's human psychology, right? I mean, where if loss aversion, I think is what it's called, right? Where if you take something away from what people already have, well, that's what gets them mad. I mean, it's not necessarily that, they don't have enough freedom or not enough money, right? It's like if you don't know what those things are, you cannot miss them, right? So really this idea of like, okay, I have this great source of entertainment, and the regime, if they were to decide to take that away, I think that the pushback that they're fearing from that decision is going to be much worse than, I guess, the status quo. Um, so yeah. So I'm not sure whether the regimes will want to shut down these services, and of course that would give a leg up ultimately to activists. Um, yeah, and so then another point that you mentioned, I think, is also quite interesting, which is the link between I guess the authoritarian regimes and wars as a form of sustaining internal legitimacy. Where okay, the Russia-Ukraine case, we saw that, and then a couple of days ago, I saw something about Saudi Arabia, where they were saying, well, the Iranians, they want to attack us, um, and then just like 2 days later, then the Wall Street Journal said, no, 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 no. I mean, this is not a serious concern right now, um, because the Saudis and the Iranians have been in a dispute for many many years now, um, and then of course Xi Jinping in China giving the obligatory speech in the party congress, that reunification with Taiwan would happen, either by peaceful or by violent means. Um, and so now, so okay, and with all of these global conflicts, I mean, I think that the role of America would have to be discussed again, because as I said, I think that the first you know 2 decades after the end of Cold War, I think that the Americans were too aggressive. I think that they were acting with too much impunity in the global order. Um, but now I feel like, okay, so now we're definitely in the world where America is sort of pulling back. I mean, things just overstretch, right? We cannot interfere in all of the conflicts in the world. Um, but now, I mean, like, so I grew up in Austria, and even though it's not part of NATO, it's a neutral country. But um, I do feel quite grateful for the Americans now playing the leadership role and sustaining the Ukrainian war effort, because you know because I don't want the Russian troops to be sitting on the border close to Austria or the rest of Europe. Yeah, I guess I don't know. I wouldn't consider myself to be a neocon, but I would say that we have become bedfellows with the uh, recent geopolitical events and changes.
So I understand exactly what you're saying there. I will just say one thing that has a couple of different parts. Supporting interventionism on grounds of human rights or security isn't just neocon, it's kind of the American consensus usually. We've been taking a step back because it's cost too much money and it's been too unpopular. But we do stuff like that every now and again. And it's a view that has widespread support. It's just that we have limited resources. Oftentimes, when we do stuff like this, it needs to be married to something else. So it's not just a human rights issue, it's human rights and national security, which often can lead to cynicism. There are a bunch of memes that are occasionally supported by foreign governments, which link this idea of uh, your dictatorship needs some more freedom and it's an excuse for war. That it's sad because it often finds a companion in a certain select type of criticism in American foreign policy. You've mentioned a couple of times American imperialism or American neo-imperialism. That's usually associated with a certain critique of American foreign policy. That critique is a bit more cynical than I can really support. But one of the things that ends up happening is that if you fully believe that critique, and you are now encountering a world where America is withdrawing, it's retrenching, you are put in an impossible situation because a lot of the reason why you might presume that there wasn't as much chaos started up by these other actors is because if America is walking around with a big stick, and there's literally a few people who write books called The Big Stick. Elliot Cohen, former dean of my old school, wrote a book called The Big Stick. If America has this big stick, not only the statement that it would be willing to support its own values, but also the willingness to do so through force, that has a certain deterrent effect. It prevents a certain amount of bad behavior. America is not doing that, then all of the emphasis on not doing bad things, these bad actions by these actors, is contingent on their own calculus, their own cost effect analysis. If no one's going to stop them from doing something, it's their own decision whether or not to do it. And sometimes they will end up doing things that the more utopian critiques could never really satisfy. If you believe that all of the problems in this world are in some ways connected to or a reaction to American neo-imperialism, which is occasionally brought up sometimes, then you're left moribund, unable to really respond when you're confronted with a reality that to a certain extent requires in America to provide some support, to be a bulwark against some of the more nasty things. So, yeah, you're not a neocon to say that you feel comfortable and confident that the United States is in some ways being a driver of NATO support to Ukraine. Under no circumstances would that make you a neocon. If anything, most people inside of the United States foreign policy establishment support that, including the neocons, but the neocons are like 10% of our community. So there are a lot of people who support that. But when there's this critique of American power as a form of imperialism, where all of its statements about support of human rights, of liberalism, is in a way a mechanism of American empire, then you're left in a situation whereby if Russia is destabilizing the international world order, you either need to drop the idea that it's an American empire that you're defending, or you end up becoming a defender of empire. And you're finding a lot of people in an intellectual space not really sure how to deal with Ukraine. And I'm sure they'll have similar problems if China tries to invade Taiwan, or if wars start reemerging in the Middle East, because the Middle East is a potential powder keg of war. They almost had a war with Qatar. Saudi Arabia almost invaded Qatar, like, what was it, 5, 6 years ago, over a GCC split. And there were other wars that were brought up as well. The more dangerous the world gets, the more you see a resurrection of the tool of war as an instrument of statecraft by countries that have no democratic restraints. The more you enter into that world, and there are people afraid that we're entering into that world, the more you need to be an advocate and a defender of a robust defensive liberal interventionism so that when another country invades an innocent country and starts slaughtering its people, that you're willing to provide some support in terms of arms, training, and economic aid. Because, I mean, that's sort of the minimum that we could do. That was the arsenal of democracy approach that we did in World War II when we were still interventionist. The idea that we would still give a large amount of lend-lease aid and assistance. Nowadays, it's military aid and assistance, like we'll help train up your army so it's more effective, and you can send some of your leaders to the United States to go to an American military academy and then go back. That's often been criticized, but it's been criticized in an age of peace. It's been criticized in an age where there are no big threats to overthrow most of what we think of as a peaceful world. If we live in a dangerous world, then not only is such a thing defensible, it becomes necessary. And there's a community inside the United States that has spent the last 30 to 40 years critiquing American power that isn't really sure how to deal with that now. So, yeah, don't think that you're a neocon. Don't feel like you're falling back on that because it's not just an anti-war crowd and a pro-war crowd. The United States has a wide range of interventionism that doesn't get as much exposure in the sociology or anthropology communities. Whereas if you're in social science and political science, like there are endless debates about this stuff.
Right. I mean, so with respect to this Taiwan issue, I mean, how would you evaluate the communication by the Biden administration? Because Biden in his speeches is saying that the U.S. would intervene on behalf of Taiwan, but then his advisors are kind of trying to walk it back, and they try to emphasize or re-emphasize the one China principle, the sort of like this strategic ambiguity, so not clearly showing the cards as to what the U.S. would be willing to do in case of a Chinese invasion. Um, yeah.
So, official US policy is still strategic ambiguity. It's just, it's difficult to say how much Is that policy likely to be followed given that Biden, President Biden, rather frequently, I believe 4 times now, stated that the United States would defend Taiwan? In fact, there was an article that came out a few months ago called "Did President Biden just Beetlejuice away strategic ambiguity?" Because he had said it 3 times then. So I believe that the question isn't so much whether or not we would support Taiwan. I think we would definitely support Taiwan. It's just a question of what that support would be. Would it be giving them a lot of money? Would be saying a lot of nice words? Would it be sending them a whole lot of weapons? Would it be sending a lot of trainers? Would it be sending the Pacific Fleet over into the region? Would it be trying to engage in some type of limited conflict with China? There's a range of options here. Almost everyone thinks that we would support Taiwan with military aid and economic aid. Almost everyone thinks that we'll do that if they're invaded by China, quote unquote. Like assuming China just invades Taiwan, we're going to give some economic support and some military support because we have more strategic alignment with Taiwan than we do Ukraine. We're going to do at least the same for Taiwan that we did to Ukraine for Ukraine. We're going to do something. Will it be war? Probably not, but there's a very real chance that it will. Part of the reason why we embraced this notion of strategic ambiguity is because, one, it prevents us from making the choice to saying it out loud and declaring forevermore that we're willing to treat Taiwan like South Korea and Japan and will literally sink all of China's navy to ensure that it is safe. So we haven't gotten that far. But by also being ambiguous, we can reassure China that perhaps we wouldn't. Perhaps we're still willing to consider Taiwan part of this one China. We use slightly different language from what the Chinese use for the one China policy or the one China principle. That ambiguity also filters into how we approach Taiwan. We also have the Taiwan Relations Act, which technically does provide some type of security guarantees to Taiwan, just more ambiguous. It's not an alliance. So there's that also in the background. Lately, though, there's been a bit of a problem with China in US domestic politics. That is, Donald Trump made China one of the only bipartisan issues agreed upon in US Congress. The dangerous thing about that is that because we live in a politicized time, you're now starting to see certain people in Congress compete with one another to be more pro Taiwan than the other side, which could lead to a spiral, which could cause a lot of problems for the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing. And this was on obvious display twice recently. Nancy Pelosi's trip and CHIPS Act enforcement for green card holders and US citizens in China. Both of those things were escalatory. We can make the argument that Pelosi's trip wasn't necessarily that big of a deal. We could make the argument that the CHIPS Act enforcement was actually the result of other things that China was doing, therefore it was entirely justified.
So
And we could make the
what were the
argument
provisions of the CHIPS Act? I mean, was it about excluding Chinese nationals
semiconductors,
from
yeah, semiconductor.
semiconductors?
Oh, so we've already had some regulations and controls on Chinese citizens working on critical infrastructure in the United States. This was a change. So this was US citizens can't work for semiconductors and chips production inside of China for Chinese companies. And green card holders can't do it. So one of the things that ended up happening was a lot of people left China recently because of recent acts by Congress. And that caused some problems for China. Because China was dependent on them because they were actually like lead engineers and lead project leads. So their withdrawal from the country, and it included a lot of Taiwanese people and a lot of Japanese people as well, excuse me. Included a lot of different people from a lot of different countries, including South Korea. So a lot of brain drain just left China. And there are people focusing on this saying, hey, I guess I've been talking too long. Hey, we have this conflict going on with Russia and Ukraine right now. Why are you poking the Chinese dragon? I want him to remain a panda. Please stop causing problems. And there are some people in the United States that are worried about this. And then there are some people cheering it on because there's been a skeptical community inside of the United States against China for like 15 years now. And they've been increasingly more prominent. I have a few friends who are working on China policy, and they are happy with the harder line that's being taken. In fact, there's a professor at Georgia Tech that is also happy about the harder line being taken. But there is a little bit of a danger where a distracted US, because we're already giving a lot of support and aid to Ukraine, shouldn't be inviting any type of politicization or strained relations over Taiwan. But some parts of our government are, and it leads to this ambiguity. It's not just strategic ambiguity at this point, it's deliberately facilitating further ambiguity in the bilateral relationship. And of course, China is to a certain self-immolating its own economy right now. So it has its own worries to deal with. So it doesn't want this to blow up either. But there's a bit of tension emerging. And this tension plays rather well or poorly, depending on your frame of mind, with the notion that the 2020s will be a tumultuous decade or dangerous decade. And this is because the United States defense infrastructure, which a lot of people like to criticize as this monstrous entity capable of conquering the world if it wanted to because of, I don't know, internecine greed and corrupt relationships between different companies in the Pentagon. The military industrial complex in the United States is actually very weak. It has no wiggle room. It's basically exhausted a lot of its historical capabilities in Ukraine. It had difficulty dealing with the rise of ISIS randomly, requiring a lot more precision munitions. And there's some real questions that we would be able to actually fight a war with what we have because our defense sector is centered for peacetime plus some counterterrorism. There's not really a lot of expansion. But the recent focus on some China issues and some of the recent exposures to tensions in our own industrial base vis-a-vis Russia has led to us to rework our ability to ramp up supplies and support, if not for ourselves, then for other potential conflict zones. So as we're ramping up our ability to do this, we're actually being compared to China's own ability. So right now, China has a relatively favorable balance of power vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis their immediate shoreline. We're better globally, and if we can get all of our stuff in the area, we're better. But because we are a global power with our assets diffused all around the world, if it's not a conflict that we planned for, then China might have an advantage because of various A2AD stuff, a lot of buzzwords. Because of China's own capabilities, there's a real chance that they could isolate or blockade Taiwan. They might even be able to invade Taiwan. So if China is aware that we're building up our capability to expand our industrial base, then China's window of opportunity to try to take Taiwan might be running down a little bit, especially if there are problems with their own economy, their own demographic bubble, their own political structure, and of course, Xi Jinping wanting to take care of this issue while he's still in power. This whole idea of can't be passed to generation. There are some people thinking that that means ordinary people. There are a few observers that means their political generational leadership. Part of the reason why Xi Jinping's still around is apparently because he has this mandate to take Taiwan back, which is something that some people believe. Could be true. I'm not saying it isn't, but it's something that some people think. And if it is true, then that makes the situation more dangerous. Because there are a lot of different points conspiring to make 2020, like this entire decade, a more dangerous one for Taiwan, which means poking the Chinese dragon is potentially dangerous, which means changing strategic ambiguity is potentially dangerous, which is why no matter what Biden says, his people automatically, like the minute after, will say, no, 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 we still support strategic ambiguity. And there's the hope that this will continue on into the next administration, whether that be 2024 or 2028. There's a lot of people trying to make sure that we don't rock the boat too much. And then there are a lot of people who want to rock the boat. And they're in different camps. It's sort of a similar situation for the debate with Russia, but in a way a little bit different. And you have different communities having different positions on this. There are a lot of people that just want to go back to engagement with China, to go back to before 2016 and try to have some constructive engagement. Germany just recently tried to do something like that, but it's in the air. I can't give you anything better than that, other than to say that things are a little bit more dangerous than they arguably should be. But I mean, I'm not expecting any type of outbreak of violence there now, nor for the next few years. Just that there are people looking at this thinking that this is a particularly dangerous near to midterm future, which is something to keep in mind. So who
Yeah,
knows?
it's certainly not ideal situation. I mean, we don't want the big powers, U.S., Russia, China, to ever be in a direct military confrontation. And I hope that there's enough people working in influential positions in all of these countries to ensure that outcome. Um, right. So, again, lastly, I mean, just a few minutes left. So, I wanted to reorient back to domestic policy because obviously we have the midterm elections that are happening just a few days. And th- there's this whole idea of like, okay, so America leads the coalition of democratic countries, but I mean, how solid is that? Well, given we have the experience with January 6th. I mean, there was a possibility. I mean, if the military establishment had sided with Trump, that which fortunately they didn't, but if they did, I mean, the outcome could have been an unraveling of democratic institutions. Yeah, so I know you were saying from your research, I mean, how important it was for you to sustain democratic institutions, but yeah, what's the scorecard for America today? I guess on this front.
There are some seams of defraying, I guess. That's not a controversial statement. A lot of people are observing local democracy in the United States with some degree of fear. I will say that some degree of fear is not the same thing as a lot of fear. So there's plenty of cause for hope and optimism. There are two things that really I'm watching out for. One are the absolute utter morons in the Democratic Party that went out and actively supported more radical Republican candidates against their more centrist colleagues. So President Biden recently made a warning about a large number of US congressional candidates that have already made statements that they're going to doubt the elections they're in. A large number of those people were supported by some Democratic pressure groups because they thought they would be more easy to beat. I don't have words for that. I don't know what to think about that. That just makes me immeasurably sad and disappointed. Like like there's no words for that. That was just horribly stupid and foolish and dangerous. So there's that. The fact that some of them were actually brought to light and supported by the other party means that maybe if there wasn't that type of action, the problem wouldn't have been that big or as big. So there's some cause for hope in that regard. Another cause for hope is that there's also been some punishment along those lines. President Trump is actively being investigated. There was a Mar-a-Lago case. There are a lot of people that are suspicious about that. There's the January 6th committee and trials that continue to go. There's still some testimony being solicited. There's some movement along those lines. So the scorecard in the US is pretty strong. I also think that there are some relatively simple measures that we could take to take the wind out of their sails. Like, I don't know why, when you're confronted with an entire group of people that are essentially deriving their entire political legitimacy on the elections are not secure enough, why you can't just say, okay, we're going to throw a couple more $1 million at election security and just like take all the wind out of their sails. Say, hey, you want to make sure that no one's voting twice? Fine. We'll randomly select a certain number of random ballots to see whether or not the name registered twice. Just like all of their complaints are about things that are easily solvable and observable. So you could just do some really simple, stupid stuff for that, and you could take the wind out of their sails.
Yeah,
It'd
but
be
your
wasted
assumption
money.
is that those people care about election integrity, right? I mean, because I think they care
It's a
about.
safe assumption because the reason why I'm saying that is because even if the leadership doesn't believe what they're saying, and I do think that some of them do, but I'm also pretty sure some of them don't. The domestic political situation, it's the people themselves that don't believe in it. So there are a large number of Republicans and even some Democrats that don't believe that the election results were valid. So in that case, do something that takes their like top three choices for electoral reform, do it, throw a couple $10 million at a problem, just burn the money, and then you end up resolving and gaining confidence in a lot of the election. I mean, I understand why
No,
some
but it's
people don't
not going
vote
to
for it.
increase the confidence because I mean, because so I think the
So,
Trumpists they care about winning the election, right? Regardless of whether it's rigged or not. I mean, if they were going to lose it, they want to rig it so they win it, and if they were going to win it anyway, then it's great, right, for them.
so I think that you are dramatically downplaying the degree to which people actually believe that the election was not valid. So these are not people who are not democratic that just want to win. These are people that believe that they were cheated. And we've had moments in American electoral politics where there were parties that thought they were cheated before. It happens with alarming frequency if you take a look at our own history. These are not people that you should take a look at and say, oh my God, 1/5 of Republicans aren't Democrats anymore in the sense of they believe in democracy and voting. That's not true. I'm willing to stake a lot on that claim. The danger is instead that these people no longer trust that the elections are valid because they're in an information space that is constantly telling them that the elections are not valid, that there are reasons to doubt, that there are various forms of conspiracies about phantom ballots showing up in the middle of the night with 99% vote and 99% Biden ballots showing up on these late ballots that
Yeah, I
overturned
get that,
Trump's
but in a
Democratic
hypothetical
election.
world where, let's say, you're being put in charge, and you're not a party member, right?
Yep.
Of ensuring these electoral reforms, um, and then Trump or the Trumpist candidate still loses the ballots, right? Still loses the vote. Then that Trumpist candidate will just get up and say, "It's still rigged. I don't trust this Murphy guy, and it's still a
Sure.
rigged."
So I get what you're saying, but the reason why I'm saying what I'm saying is because there's a disentanglement between political elites and political believers. So the elites are going to do whatever the hell they want most of the time. So there's about 100 candidates that say that they are doubtful about the election results before they even go into it. Good news, most of them are in uncompetitive districts. They're not going to lose, which means that they're going to be in an uncomfortable situation of saying, hey, look at the 100 candidates that said that they wouldn't trust it. 70 of them won. I guess that means what exactly? So, yeah, that's happening. But also, if you take seriously the claim that there's a large number of the electorate that disputes an election, and they have certain things that you can go to in order to say this is what they want in order to have it, and it's pretty standard and something that they could verify, then go for it. And if the problem is that it's me overseeing these elections or some kind of an apolitical bureaucrat, which a lot of them just read as Democrats without the title, then make like bipartisan commissions. Be like, hey, you guys think that there's some shady things going on. Stand in this corner, look around, and then before any ballot is counted, just tell me whether or not you think anything suspicious happened. And hey, you think that a lot of dead people are voting? I have an idea. How about we take a look? How many people with their name attached had a ballot who died before election day and didn't absentee ballot? Like there are ways that you could game this out because some of this is just because they've been enabled in a delusion. And this delusion is enabled in large part because they're able to say there's nothing out there contradicting my viewpoint, sometimes because they don't look when it's obviously there, but other times because there's not really that effort to engage people who believe crazy and outrageous things. I believe, honestly, that you should engage with that. But okay, we're going to put that to the side because I think that we might just disagree with that moving forward. The other thing about that scorecard that you raised for a reason was vis-a-vis Ukraine. So this notion that you might see increased politicization of the Ukraine conflict. Rather infamously, early on in the conflict, Rand Paul provided some stonewalling on Ukraine assistance. And in one of the articles I wrote about the conflict, I had mentioned that Rand Paul was alone now, but he might not be alone in the future. Well, he's not alone anymore. There are quite a few Republicans that are increasingly skeptical of it. And there are even some progressives that are skeptical of it, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and 20 progressive members of Congress sent out that letter saying it's time for negotiations, it's time to end the war.
And then they pulled it back again, apparently.
They did pull it back. That's true. And I mean, even Rand Paul pulled back his opposition because it needed to happen. But so you have this growing discontent, and this discontent is more prominent among Republicans and Democrats. Think of it like populism. It was more prominent among Republicans and Democrats in 2016. It was more prominent among Republicans, and Republicans are increasingly concerned about this. And so long as everyone's supporting the war right now, it's not really a problem. But after the midterms, maybe you're going to find a whole lot more Republicans because they're going to be relatively in charge of Congress, probably, it looks like, just because of polling. So if you end up having more Republicans in Congress, you're going to have more potential outlets for them to bring up disagreements. I think that was more prominent inside of the House of Congress. There were more congressmen that were opposing the war in Ukraine right now. And there's, of course, conspiracism. There was recently a report saying that the United States was monitoring disinformation about the Ukraine war. Well, among some of the more populist people, they were just saying that you're not even allowed to think freely about the Ukraine conflict,
By
which
freely, they mean, we have to surrender.
disagree with it. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Like it's I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to say that there are avenues for disinformation that is now starting to cause some problems, so that you might start to see increased Republican resistance to supporting the war in Ukraine. It might happen. We're starting to see some of that in Europe. So, for instance, the Five Star Movement in Italy was actually brought down in part because the party split over support of Ukraine. One side wanted to support, one side didn't.
Well, but Meloni, I mean, the new prime minister, she just signed a huge consignment of new weapons and
Oh yeah,
tanks and things like that.
she is actually pretty much anti-Putin. She's also moderated a lot of her policies. Like she's not her official policy positions are not as far right as she was when she was younger, and basically, I think she was a member of a very far right organization when she was like in her 20s. But that happened. But her government was also causing some problem. Was also facing some issues because of Berlusconi. Berlusconi, rather famously a pro-Putin ally, and
And Salvini too.
yeah, yeah, the current one. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Lega, the Lega
Yeah,
Party.
Lega Nord, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, they have their weak spots to the point where the current prime minister said that if they aren't willing to get along with the program, she's going to make a new coalition with other people. That'll be fun to see if she actually can pull that off.
No, but
But
the fact
there,
that they signed the consignment of weapons, it suggests to me that how should I say, Meloni's wearing the pants in the government.
oh yeah, and I mean she definitely had the majority party. The other two are very much junior partners in this. So yeah, there's this going on. So that's a cause for hope. But the fact that the initial governments fell apart because of the conflict is a cause for concern. There's some issue about Balkan and Central European politics vis-a-vis Russia as well. Hungary, the perennial problem. And then there is occasionally some resistance that's emerging in other parts of Europe, depending on how much pain and pressure happens. You yourself brought this up when you were talking about when you were reading some Austrian articles. There's a real chance that this war will become costly for Europe in some sense, and that the costlier the war gets, the more you might see democratic parties start to turn away from this, and the more openings that you might find for more Putin sympathetic or Putin curious parties affiliated with populist movements. So you're going to see some openings for that. Granted, like a lot of them are not exactly happy that Putin invaded a country. So you shouldn't just assume that because you're a populist, you're automatically pro invading Ukraine. It's just there is some rumbling over there that we need to be careful of and monitor. And the more careful we are in monitoring that, the more it feeds into this domestic political argument that there's a chance that maybe the pro-Ukraine position will still hold, but support for how much they give them every month will go down a little bit. So still pro-Ukraine, but slightly diminished volume in munitions or people over there training up people. That could be a problem. And of course, there are various other concerns as well, which means that there are just people waiting for the breakup of the European coalition, or that the United States will be partially crippled um, post midterms coming right up. So we'll find out pretty soon. So that's coming up right around the corner. Putin himself and the Russian government, they're convinced that in the long run, the coalition will break down. They're convinced that that will eventually happen. And they're convinced that as a consequence, once that coalition starts breaking down, once this aid to Ukraine starts diminishing, they'll be able to pull back the conflict and find some type of amenable peace solution. It's important to realize that Putin's war aims, while they are officially still regime change, that's not going to be what it looks like in the final settlement. Not unless something horrible happens to Ukraine. And I do mean horrible. What's going to happen is that there's going to be some type of deadlock and there's going to be some type of peace that emerges. Because even the loser in a war needs to acknowledge defeat. The Taliban in Afghanistan, just for an example, technologically weaker force, had almost no people, had no popular support, had no control over territory, was basically in Pakistan. And the war lasted for 20 more years. And they now run Afghanistan, much to everyone's sorrow and pain and suffering. Russia is losing, but it hasn't lost. And even if Russia does lose, it needs to admit defeat. Wars are political games fought with bullets and people's lives, which means that there's no end to this conflict that isn't ultimately some type of political resolution to the conflict. And ultimately, Putin, or maybe there's a change in leadership, but ultimately, Putin and Moscow need to find some terms to end the conflict. And ultimately, Ukraine likewise needs to be okay with that, whatever settlement it gets. And it might be that it looks like a pre-war antebellum type period. Like we're just going to go back to the borders that we had before. Maybe Putin will have slightly more, or maybe Putin will have slightly less. We don't really know. But wars are political games, and they're reflective more often of things going on outside of the war than on the battles themselves. So battles will continue to rage. But the problem of whether or not wars are sustainable and whether or not they'll continue depends on the outside. Like the United States wasn't losing any battles in Afghanistan when we lost. We weren't even losing any people. Our total casualties were like 10 in 10 years. Conflict in Ukraine, I don't want to draw any parallels to it. I'm just saying the lesson learned is that it's a political conflict as much as it is a military one. Whether or not the coalition remains stable, whether or not support continues to go in, are factors determining whether or not Ukraine will be able to win the conflict. And whether or not Russia is able to make sure that its mobilization happens and it's still able to get arms is contingent on a number of other factors, which also means that their ability to continue to fight, to continue to invade or defend in Ukrainian territory is linked to those external factors. People taking those equations and holding them constant see a never-ending war of attrition that might never end. People that decide that the balance is in one side or the other side end up doing their own thing. So like early on in this war, we thought that time was on Ukraine's side, not Russia. They'd run out of people, they'd run out of munitions. That meant that it was only a matter of time before the conflict was resolved favorable to Ukraine. If this coalition starts to break apart and if we start finding more problems, then the balance might shift. And then it then becomes how long until Putin gets what he wants. And there's going to be this constant tug of war because analytical communities are not omniscient. They don't have perfect information awareness. They don't know everything. They don't know what contingent factors are happening. And no one on planet Earth will tell you that they know when Russia's going to run into real problems firing guns or when Europe might start to lose a lot of its support for the Ukraine conflict. No one knows. We don't. The beginning of the Afghan war, 90% approval rating for George W. Bush, most universally respected and supported conflict in recent memory. Even the invasion of Iraq, yeah, there were a lot of people initially skeptical of it, but it still had broad support, and George W. Bush's administration was still in the high 70s approval rating, and it got most of the Democratic Party on board. Move on 4 years, Iraq's deeply unpopular, Afghanistan still has some popularity. Move on 15, even Afghanistan is now an unpopular war. Those are things that you wouldn't predict. Those are things that you don't understand about conflict. We're trying to take what we know now and abstract the future out of it. But we can't be too certain that we know what any of those results are going to be. The second to last article I wrote for the Daily Beast, just to make this full circle because we're starting to run out of time. The second to last article I wrote was that the primary thesis was that we should stop trying to predict how this war will end. Because there are multiple endings. They're contingent on a lot of different factors. Focusing on an endpoint when you don't know how the middle is going to be resolved is counterproductive. It's not the end that matters, at least not right now. There are ends that we're going to be moving towards. Different political leaders have certain desirable endpoints. But the primary focus on the Ukraine conflict must be to understand the push and pull on the battlefield as it is today, as well as the potential breakpoints that are behind enemy lines. Not just Russia's, but our own. And as we work back and forth in this never-ending analytical enterprise to try to figure out what are all of these potential breakpoints, how can we try to identify them and resolve them before they are ultimately reached on our side, and how we might be able to facilitate them being reached on their side, we just don't really know. And we're going to keep on trying to understand this conflict. It could be that this war will end spring 2023. It could be that we'll still be asking how it will end in 2026. And part of the reason why we don't know when this war will end is because we don't know how long our united resolve to support Ukraine will last, because that's a known unknown. There's going to be natural limits to how we try to understand the endpoint of this conflict. It is hoped rather strongly, especially by me, that our support doesn't wane in the foreseeable near term, mid-term, long-term future, that we're going to support them regardless of any political partisan games that happen in the United States, that Europe will ultimately decide that no amount of temporary hardship will be worth the compromises that they will make in order to gain temporary economic security at the cost of Ukraine's sovereignty. It is my hope and it is my firm wish and it is my belief that Russia is wrong, that it can't outlast us on this one. I believe that Ukraine will win, whatever winning means, because we don't know what that means yet, so long as we're able to continue to give them support. And then after this war is over, whatever it looks like, I hope that we will continue to support Ukraine in its political and economic transformation, because right now, a lot of that country is in ruin. And if part of it remains occupied once this is over, we're going to need to put a lot of effort into making sure that Ukraine can be an economically vital, or at very least vibrant and thriving country once peace, whatever peace it is, whenever it finally arrives, is obtained. So that's my final thought on this conflict. I really think that so long as we hold the line, which I severely and sincerely hope that we do, this will ultimately have a very good endpoint, and we won't need to worry about Russian nukes or the end of the global economy. That it will just be a peace that we can all live with, that we can all be happy with, except, of course, for maybe Putin.
I would certainly agree. I mean, I think that the factors of uncertainty is, Western unity and resolve versus, Russian, I guess, exhaustion of their internal resources. And depending on which factor is going to take overhand, I think that's what's going to determine the outcome of the conflict. I mean, as for the Ukrainians themselves, uh, I, I think they have an absolute fighting spirit. I mean, they've shown that since February. They've shown that since 2014. So, because for them, they're fighting for the homeland. I mean, they're fighting for the Ukrainian identity. And every time that the Russians left an area, right, like Bucha, Izium, in the Kharkiv area, and they dig up these mass graves, and then also the teachers, the Ukrainian language teachers, that are getting punished for teaching Ukrainian language, so they have to teach in Russian. I mean, like it's such an existential struggle, both in terms of actual lives, as well as the Ukrainian culture and identity. That yeah, it's not going to be the failure of the fighting spirit, in my view, that's going to determine the outcome of the war. I do think it's either going to be something in Russia, like internal overthrow of Putin or something like that, or the Western fatigue that's going to tilt the balance in one way or another. Um, but yeah, uh, yeah. So yeah, these would be my thoughts on it. So I think this would be a good wrap, unless you have anything else you want to throw in. Okay, so Dennis, thank you very much for joining me in this podcast, this great conversation. I hope that the audience learned a lot from this discussion.
My pleasure.